Welcome to another video on stories of our history. In the autumn of 480 before Christ, on the narrow coastal plain of Thermopylae where the mountains of central Greece descend steeply into the Aegean Sea, a small force of Greek hoplites commanded by the Spartan king Leonidas prepared to make their last stand against the largest invasion army the world had ever seen. For 2 days they had held the pass against wave after wave of Persian infantry, their bronze shields locked together in the phalanx, their long spears thrusting over the rim of the shields into the faces and chests of the attackers. The Persian king Xerxes, watching from a throne set up on a nearby hill, had already sent his Medes and his Scythians against the Greek line, and they had been thrown back with heavy losses. Then, in a moment of frustration that would become legendary, Xerxes gave the order that would test the mettle of his most feared warriors. He commanded his elite corps, the 10,000 men whom the Greeks called the Athenata, the Immortals, to advance and sweep these insolent Spartans into the sea. The Immortals rose from their camp, their scale armor glittering in the late summer sun, their spears tipped with silver pomegranates, their wicker shields covered with leather and studded with gold. They moved forward in perfect order, a disciplined column of professional soldiers who had never known defeat, the pride of the Achaemenid Empire. But in the narrow defile of the hot gates, where numbers counted for nothing and the terrain favored the heavily armored Greek hoplites, the Immortals met a wall of bronze and flesh that even they could not break. Their shorter spears could not outreach the Greek dory, their wicker shields could not withstand the thrust of the Spartan lance, and the bodies of the fallen piled up at the entrance to the pass until Xerxes, leaping from his throne in anguish, watched his finest troops recoil. Yet the Immortals did not flee. They withdrew in good order, leaving their dead behind them, their reputation tarnished but their discipline intact. The story of the Immortals at Thermopylae, immortalized by Herodotus and debated by military historians to this day, is only one chapter in the long and fascinating history of this unique military institution, an institution that was as much a symbol of Persian imperial ideology as it was a fighting force. To understand the Immortals, we must go back 2 centuries before Thermopylae, to the rugged highlands of Fars in southern Iran, where a young Persian chieftain named Cyrus began to forge an empire and an army that would change the course of history. The figure of the Immortals, as we know them, emerges from the mists of ancient history primarily through the writings of Herodotus of Halicarnassus, the Greek historian who wrote his monumental work, the Histories, in the mid-5th century before Christ, roughly a generation after the Persian Wars that defined the course of Western civilization. Herodotus was an indefatigable traveler and a collector of stories, and his account of the Persian Empire, its kings, its customs, and its army, is the most detailed literary source that has come down to us from antiquity. In Book 7 of his Histories, Herodotus provides a grand catalogue of the forces that Xerxes assembled for the invasion of Greece, a catalogue that reads like an ethnographer's dream, enumerating the dozens of different peoples who marched under the Persian banner, their outlandish costumes and their exotic weapons, their tribal chiefs and their strange customs. When he comes to the core of the Persian army, the troops that the great king himself relied upon, Herodotus pauses and delivers a description that has captivated readers for 2.5 millennia. He writes, "These were the best of the troops, first the Persians, who were equipped as follows. On their heads they wore tiaras, as they are called, which are loose felt caps, on their bodies, sleeved tunics embroidered with iron scales, like the scales of a fish, on their legs, trousers. Instead of the usual wicker shields, they had shields of wickerwork with a leather covering, and beneath the shield hung a quiver. They carried short spears, large bows with arrows of reed, and daggers that hung from the belt beside the right thigh." Then Herodotus names this elite contingent and explains the source of their fame. These Persians were called by the Greeks the Immortals, for the following reason. Whenever any one of them made the number incomplete because of death or disease, another man was chosen to take his place, so that they were never more nor fewer than 10,000. Of all the troops, they were the most adorned with gold and the most splendid to behold. Their bravery in battle matched their appearance, and they were the most skilled of all the infantry in the arts of war. This passage, brief as it is, has been the foundation of every subsequent account of the Immortals, from the sober histories of modern scholars to the vivid depictions in films, novels, and video games. The name Athenata, which means without death or deathless in Greek, is almost certainly a Greek coinage, not a direct translation of an old Persian term. The Persians themselves, in their royal inscriptions at Persepolis, Susa, and Nakshi-Rostam, do not mention a unit called the Immortals. The administrative tablets from Persepolis, tens of thousands of clay documents that record the daily operations of the imperial court and the distribution of rations to workers and soldiers, refer to various groups of troops and guards, but they do not single out a special corps of 10,000 immortals as distinct from the general mass of the Persian infantry. This silence in the Persian sources has led some skeptical scholars to question whether the immortals existed at all in the form that Herodotus describes. Perhaps the Greek historian, or his informants, exaggerated the size, the cohesion, and the mystique of a regular royal guard, transforming a mundane military unit into a legendary fighting force for the purposes of a good story. The Persians certainly had elite guards. The reliefs at Persepolis show ranks of guardsmen in Persian and Median dress, carrying spears and bows, and the Greek historians regularly mention the bodyguards of the king, the Dorophoroi, who protected his person and executed his commands. But was there a permanent, numbered corps of exactly 10,000 men, whose ranks were instantly replenished, and whose primary function was to serve as the heavy infantry of the imperial army? The majority of modern historians, after a century and a half of debate and analysis, have concluded that the answer is a qualified yes. The Immortals did exist as an identifiable unit, though the Greek accounts have been embellished and schematized. The Persian Empire, with its vast resources and its need for a reliable standing army, certainly had the capacity to create and maintain such a corps, and the archaeological evidence, particularly the reliefs and the glazed brick friezes from Susa and Persepolis, provides visual confirmation of the uniform equipment that Herodotus describes. The Immortals were not a myth. They were a military reality, and their story begins not with Xerxes but with the founder of the Achaemenid dynasty, Cyrus the Great. The historical origins of the Immortals, like the origins of the Persian Empire itself, are shrouded in the mists of a preliterate warrior culture that only later, under the Achaemenid kings, began to record its own achievements in monumental inscriptions. The Persian tribes that migrated onto the Iranian plateau sometime in the early 1st millennium before Christ were part of the larger Indo-Iranian family, speakers of languages closely related to those of the Medes, the Scythians, and the ancestors of the Vedic peoples of India. These tribes were pastoralists and horse breeders, organized into clans and tribal confederacies, and their social structure was dominated by a warrior aristocracy whose ethos of loyalty, courage, and truthfulness would later be encoded in the royal ideology of the Achaemenids. The Greek historian Herodotus, drawing on Persian oral traditions, reports that the Persians educated their sons from the age of 5 to 20 in 3 things only: to ride a horse, to shoot the bow, and to speak the truth. This triad of skills, equestrianism, archery, and honesty, was the foundation of Persian military culture, and it produced a type of warrior who was mobile, deadly at a distance, and bound by a code of personal integrity that was considered essential for the cohesion of the army and the loyalty of the troops to their commander. The Persians were not, in their early history, a state with a standing army. They were a tribal confederation that fought as a militia, each nobleman bringing his retainers and his kinsmen to the field when the king summoned them. The Medes, their northern neighbors and erstwhile overlords, had a more developed military organization, and when Cyrus the Great led the Persian revolt against Median rule around 550 before Christ, he incorporated the Median military traditions into his own nascent army. The fusion of Persian and Median elites, a hallmark of Cyrus's political genius, was mirrored in the military sphere, where the hardy Persian mountaineers and the more urbanized Medes combined to form the nucleus of what would become the imperial army. Cyrus's military innovations were not limited to the political integration of conquered peoples. He also transformed the structure and the ethos of the Persian forces in ways that prefigured the later Immortals. The Assyrian and Babylonian empires that had preceded the Achaemenids had relied on massed levies of peasant conscripts, stiffened by a corps of professional soldiers and foreign mercenaries, to fill the ranks of their enormous armies. These conscript armies were clumsy, slow to mobilize, and prone to desertion, and their maintenance required a system of brutal coercion that alienated the subject populations. Cyrus, who had observed the weaknesses of the empires he conquered, adopted a different approach. He created a small, permanent, professional army that was loyal to him personally, a force that could be deployed quickly, that could fight with a cohesion and a morale that conscript armies could not match, and that could serve as the cadre around which a larger levy could be assembled when the need arose. The Greek writer Xenophon, in his fictionalized biography of Cyrus, the Cyropedia, describes in detail the reforms that Cyrus instituted: the establishment of a standing regiment of 10,000 Persian spearmen, the imposition of a strict chain of command, the creation of an officer corps drawn from the nobility, and the institution of a rigorous training regimen that transformed the Persian warrior from a brave but undisciplined tribesman into a professional soldier. Xenophon's account, though idealized and anachronistic, captures an essential truth about the Achaemenid military. It was a professional, hierarchical, and meritocratic institution that was unlike anything that had existed before in the Near East. The Immortals, whether they were originally created by Cyrus or by his successor Cambyses or by Darius the Great, were the fullest expression of this new model of imperial soldiering. They were not a temporary levy, they were a permanent corps, continuously maintained, continuously trained, and continuously ready for war. The number 10,000, which became their defining characteristic, was not an arbitrary round figure but a deliberate choice that reflected both the administrative logic of the empire and the symbolic language of Persian kingship. In the Achaemenid court, the number 10,000, or myriad in Greek, had a quasi-sacred resonance. It represented completeness, perfection, and the immense power of the king who commanded such a host. The Immortals were, in this sense, a living emblem of the king's authority, a microcosm of the empire itself, a force that embodied the order, the discipline, and the invincibility that the king claimed for his realm. The question of when the Immortals were formally established as the 10,000-strong corps described by Herodotus cannot be answered with certainty from the surviving sources. The Persian inscriptions of Cyrus, Darius, and Xerxes, though they mention the royal guard and the army in general terms, do not provide the kind of detailed organizational history that modern scholars crave. The earliest pictorial evidence that may depict the Immortals comes from the glazed brick reliefs of the palace of Darius I at Susa, which show long processions of guardsmen in richly decorated robes, their arms alternating between a spear and a bow, their faces impassive, their posture erect. These friezes, which date to the early 5th century before Christ, exactly the period of the Persian Wars, are the closest thing we have to a visual portrait of the Immortals in their full ceremonial splendor. The guardsmen on the Susa reliefs are not identical. Some wear Persian dress, with the characteristic fluted felt cap and the long, pleated robe, while others wear Median dress, with the rounded cap and the knee-length tunic over trousers. This distinction, which appears consistently in Achaemenid royal art, reflects the dual nature of the Persian Empire as a partnership between the Persians and the Medes, a partnership that was also reflected in the composition of the Immortals. The Persian and Median guards who appear side by side on the walls of the palace may represent the two halves of the royal guard, or they may depict the 10,000 Immortals themselves, with the Persian contingent, the elite of the elite, distinguished by their dress and their weapons. Herodotus explicitly states that the Immortals included both Persians and Medes, and he notes that the Persians were the more numerous and the more honored. The 1,000 soldiers who constituted the king's personal bodyguard, the very tip of the spear, were selected from the finest noble families of Persia, and they were distinguished from the rest of the Immortals by the golden apples or pomegranates that adorned the butt of their spears, while the other 9,000 carried silver. This detail, which Herodotus reports with precision, is a clue to the internal organization of the Immortals, a hierarchy of prestige and proximity to the king that was expressed in the material culture of the corps. The golden apples were not merely decorative. They were badges of honor, visible markers of the status of the men who were trusted with the life of the great king. The training and recruitment of the Immortals, though never described in detail by the ancient sources, can be partially reconstructed from the general accounts of Persian education and from the comparative evidence of other elite military units in the ancient world. The Persian noble youth, as we have noted, were trained from childhood in the three essential skills of riding, shooting, and truth-telling, and the best of them were selected for service in the royal guard. The physical standards for the Immortals must have been rigorous. The reliefs at Persepolis and Susa show men of a uniform height and build, with the erect carriage of soldiers who have spent years perfecting their physical condition. The training regimen likely included long marches in full equipment, practice with the spear, the bow, and the sword, and the complex maneuvers that the Immortals executed on the battlefield, the silent advance in close order, the rapid deployment from column into line, and the disciplined withdrawal under fire. The Persian army, as a whole, was organized according to the decimal system, a system of units based on the number 10 that was ideally suited to the bureaucratic mentality of the Achaemenid administration. The basic unit was the Dathabam of 10 men, commanded by a Dathopatus. 10 Dathabams formed a Satabam of 100 men, commanded by a Satopatus. 10 Satabams formed a Hazarabam of 1,000 men, commanded by a Hazarapatus. And 10 Hazarabams formed the Bivarabam of 10,000 men, the Immortals themselves, commanded by the Hazarapatus of the Hazarapatus, the chief of the 1,000, who was one of the highest officials in the empire. This decimal organization, which was both an administrative convenience and a tactical framework, allowed the Immortals to be divided and combined with a flexibility that was the hallmark of professional armies. The Hazarabam, the regiment of 1,000 men, was the fundamental tactical unit, capable of operating independently or in concert with the other regiments, and its commander, the Hazarapatus, was a man of great authority and prestige, often a member of the royal family or one of the great noble houses. The officer corps of the Immortals was a school of command, a training ground for the future satraps and generals of the empire, and the experience of leading 1,000 men in battle was the essential qualification for the highest military and political offices. The equipment and armament of the Immortals, as described by Herodotus and confirmed by the archaeological record, were a careful compromise between mobility, protection, and offensive power, a synthesis of the military traditions of the Iranian plateau and the Near Eastern empires that the Persians had conquered. The most distinctive element of the Immortals' panoply was his headgear, the tiara or kirbasa, a loose felt cap that could be pulled down over the ears and the neck to protect against the sun, the wind, and the glancing blows of missiles. The tiara was not a helmet in the Greek sense. It provided no protection against a direct sword cut or a spear thrust, and the Persian soldiers who faced the heavily armored Greek hoplites at Plataea and Marathon paid a terrible price for their lack of metal head protection. The Persian reliefs, however, show some guardsmen wearing what appears to be a metal helmet, a conical or rounded cap that may have been issued to the Immortals on campaign, and the excavations at Persepolis and Susa have uncovered fragments of bronze and iron helmets that suggest that the Persians were not entirely ignorant of the protective value of metal armor. The torso was protected by a sleeved tunic that was covered with overlapping iron scales, a type of armor known as scale armor or fish scale armor, which was widely used in the ancient Near East from the 2nd millennium before Christ onward. The scales, which were sewn onto a leather or fabric backing, provided a flexible and reasonably effective defense against cuts and thrusts, and their overlapping arrangement distributed the force of a blow across a larger area, reducing the likelihood of penetration. The scale armor of the Immortals was lighter and more comfortable than the solid bronze cuirass of the Greek hoplite, but it was also less protective. A powerful thrust from a Greek spear could pierce the scales and the backing beneath, as the Persian dead at Thermopylae and Plataea discovered to their cost. The Immortals' armor was designed for a different kind of warfare than the shock combat of the Greek phalanx. It was designed for mobility, for the rapid advance and withdrawal, for the archery duel and the pursuit of a broken enemy, a style of fighting that the Persians had developed on the open plains of the Iranian plateau and the steppes of Central Asia. The offensive weapons of the Immortals were a triad of bow, spear, and dagger, a combination that gave them tactical flexibility and allowed them to engage the enemy at a distance, at close quarters, or in the desperate chaos of a hand-to-hand melee. The bow was the traditional weapon of the Iranian peoples, and the Persians were famous throughout the ancient world for their skill as archers. The Persian bow was a composite bow made of horn, wood, and sinew laminated together, a design that had been developed on the Eurasian steppes and that provided immense power in a compact, manageable form. The arrows, carried in a quiver that hung from the belt behind the shield, were made of reed and tipped with bronze or iron points, and a skilled archer could loose a dozen shafts in a minute, darkening the sky with a cloud of missiles that could break the charge of infantry or cavalry before they reached the Persian line. The Immortals, however, were not primarily archers. They were heavy infantry, and their primary weapon was the spear, a weapon about 6 feet long with a broad iron blade and a silver or gold counterweight at the butt that could be used as a secondary stabbing point if the spearhead broke. The spear of the Immortal was shorter than the Greek dory, which could be up to 9 feet in length, and this discrepancy in reach was a critical disadvantage when the two formations collided. The Greek hoplite, thrusting over the rim of his large bronze-faced shield, could strike the Persian before the Persian could strike him, and the Persian's wicker shield, though light and maneuverable, was not strong enough to deflect the heavy Greek spear. The dagger, the akinax, was a short, straight, double-edged sword that was worn on the right thigh, suspended from a belt that was often elaborately decorated with gold and precious stones. The akinax was a symbol of Persian manhood and nobility, and its use in close combat was a last resort, a weapon for the desperate scrum that occurred when the battle line had broken and the fighting had degenerated into a chaos of individual duels. The Immortals, with their bows, their spears, and their daggers, were equipped for the full spectrum of ancient warfare, and their ability to switch from missile to shock to hand-to-hand combat made them a formidable opponent on any terrain. The shield of the Immortals, as described by Herodotus, was a large rectangular shield made of wickerwork and covered with leather, a design that was common throughout the Near East and that had been used by the Assyrians and Babylonians for centuries. The wicker shield, known as the spara or garin in Greek, was made of reeds or withies woven tightly together and bent into a shape that was convex from side to side and flat from top to bottom, with a leather covering that was often decorated with a metal boss or a painted emblem. The shield was light, easy to carry on the march, and could be planted in the ground to form a temporary defensive wall, a tactic that the Persians used to good effect in their battles with the Greeks. The famous Persian shield wall, behind which the archers loosed their volleys, was a formation that required the shields to be locked together, and the wicker construction, with its flexibility and its ability to absorb the impact of arrows, was well suited for this purpose. But the wicker shield was a poor defense against the heavy thrust of a Greek hoplite spear, which could easily pierce the woven reeds and the leather covering, and at close quarters the Immortal found himself at a severe disadvantage against an opponent who carried a bronze-faced wooden shield that could turn a spear point and a bronze cuirass that could stop a sword cut. The Persian solution to this tactical problem, which they never fully solved, was to avoid close combat with the Greek hoplites whenever possible, to use their cavalry and their archers to disrupt the Greek formation, and to engage the hoplites only on terrain that negated their advantages, such as the narrow pass at Thermopylae or the steep slopes of a mountain defile. The Immortals, for all their skill and their discipline, were not supermen. They were soldiers who fought with the weapons they had been given, and their equipment reflected the strategic priorities and the cultural traditions of the society that produced them. The ceremonial aspect of the Immortals' equipment, the gold and silver that adorned their weapons and their dress, was not merely a display of wealth. It was a political statement, a declaration of the power and the legitimacy of the king whom they served. The Immortals were the visible symbol of the empire, the men who surrounded the king on the march, who guarded his tent at night, who lined the walls of the palace at Persepolis, and who received the tribute delegations on the great staircase of the Apadana. The gold and silver that glittered on their spears, their daggers, and their belts were the spoils of the empire, the tribute that had been paid by the 23 satrapies, transformed into the insignia of the imperial guard. The psychological impact of this display, on both the subjects of the empire and its enemies, was immense. The ambassadors who came to Susa or Persepolis to pay homage to the great king were greeted by ranks of Immortals, their spears tipped with pomegranates of gold, their faces impassive, their silence more intimidating than any spoken threat. The message was clear: the king was the ruler of the world, and the men who guarded him were the finest warriors that the world had ever seen. The Immortals were not only soldiers, they were actors in the grand theater of Persian kingship, and their role required them to look the part as well as to fight it. The Greek historian Xenophon, who served as a mercenary in the army of Cyrus the Younger and who saw the Persian court at first hand, was deeply impressed by the splendor and the discipline of the royal guard, and his descriptions of the Persian army in the Cyropedia are filled with admiration for the order, the precision, and the aesthetic beauty of the Immortals on parade. The golden apples on the spears of the 1,000 were not merely ornaments. They were the visible sign of the king's favor, the mark of the men who had been chosen, from all the nobility of Persia, to stand closest to the throne. The Immortals were, in a profound sense, the embodiment of the empire, and their equipment was the language through which that embodiment was expressed. The tactical organization and battlefield doctrine of the Immortals were the products of centuries of military evolution on the Iranian plateau, a tradition that valued mobility, firepower, and discipline over the brute shock of the armored phalanx that dominated the battlefields of Greece. The Immortals fought as heavy infantry, but their heaviness was relative, not absolute. They were heavier than the light-armed skirmishers who opened the battle with javelins and slings, but they were lighter than the hoplites of Sparta or Athens, whose panoply of bronze cuirass, greaves, helmet, and shield weighed over 30 kilograms. The Immortal could march faster, maneuver more easily, and fight for longer without exhaustion than his Greek counterpart, and these advantages, when properly exploited, could be decisive. The Persian battle plan, as far as it can be reconstructed from the accounts of the Greek historians, was to engage the enemy at a distance with archery, to wear down his formation with a continuous rain of missiles, and then to charge with the spear when the enemy line had been thinned and disrupted. The Immortals, in this scheme, were the anvil on which the enemy was broken. They formed the center of the Persian line, a solid block of 10,000 men in close order, their shields locked together, their spears leveled, advancing with a measured, deliberate step that was intended to intimidate as much as to destroy. On the flanks, the Persian cavalry, the best in the world, would sweep around the enemy and attack his rear, while the light infantry, the archers and the slingers, kept up a harassing fire from the front and the sides. The Immortals were the pivot of this combined arms machine, the steady, unbreakable core that gave the cavalry and the light troops the freedom to maneuver. If the enemy charged the center, the Immortals were expected to hold, to absorb the shock, and to counterattack. If the enemy broke, the Immortals were the ones who would lead the pursuit, cutting down the fugitives with their spears and their daggers. This tactical system, which required a high degree of coordination and discipline, was perfectly suited to the wide, open plains of Mesopotamia and the Iranian plateau, where the Persian cavalry could operate freely and the Immortals could deploy in their full width. It was less effective in the narrow, broken terrain of Greece, where the cavalry could not maneuver and the Immortals were forced to fight frontally against a heavier, better armored infantry that was optimized for exactly that kind of battle. The command structure of the Immortals was designed to ensure that the 10,000 men functioned as a single, cohesive organism, responsive to the will of the king and his generals, and capable of executing complex maneuvers under the stress of combat. The overall commander of the Immortals was the Hazaropatus, the chief of the 1,000, a title that originally meant the commander of 1,000 men but that had evolved to denote the commander of the 10,000 and one of the most powerful officials in the empire. The Hazaropatus was more than a general. He was a vizier, a chief of staff, the man who controlled access to the king, who transmitted the royal orders to the army, and who acted as the king's representative in military and diplomatic affairs. The Greek sources, which often translate Persian titles into their own terms, refer to the Hazaropatus as the Chiliarch, the commander of 1,000, and the confusion between the 1,000 and the 10,000 reflects the dual role of this officer as both the head of the royal guard and the second in command of the entire imperial army. The most famous Chiliarch in history is perhaps Artabanus, the commander of the guard under Xerxes, who was involved in the assassination of the king and the subsequent palace intrigues, a reminder that the power of the Hazaropatus was not only military but political, and that the commander of the Immortals could make and unmake kings. Beneath the Hazaropatus, the Immortals were organized into 10 regiments of 1,000 men, each commanded by a Hazaropatus in the original sense, a colonel who was responsible for the training, the discipline, and the combat readiness of his unit. The colonel was assisted by officers of lower rank, the Satapatis of the 100 and the Dathapatis of the 10, who formed the backbone of the corps and who translated the orders of the high command into the actions of the individual soldiers. The officer corps of the Immortals was a meritocracy of talent and loyalty, a ladder that ambitious young nobles could climb if they proved themselves in battle and in the service of the king. The Immortals were not a hereditary caste. They were a professional military unit, and their officers earned their commands through demonstrated competence, a system that was unusual in the ancient world, where military rank was often a function of birth or wealth rather than ability. The logistical system that sustained the Immortals on campaign was as impressive, in its own way, as the fighting prowess of the men themselves. The Achaemenid Empire was famous for its roads, its posting stations, and its efficient supply network, and the Immortals, as the premier unit of the imperial army, were the beneficiaries of this logistical infrastructure. When the king marched to war, the route was prepared in advance, with supply depots established at regular intervals, with water and fodder for the horses, with food for the soldiers, and with spare weapons and equipment to replace what was lost or broken. The Immortals traveled with a vast train of servants, cooks, grooms, and wagons, a mobile city that followed the army on the march and that ensured that the fighting men were well fed, well rested, and ready for battle. The contrast with the Greek armies, which were typically small, poorly supplied, and dependent on what they could plunder from the countryside, was stark. The Persian army, at its best, was a triumph of logistics, a machine that could move 100,000 men from the Euphrates to the Aegean without starving them, and the Immortals were the nucleus around which this machine was organized. The baggage train of the Immortals included not only the necessities of food and weapons but also the luxuries that befitted the elite of the empire: ornate tents, carpets, gold and silver vessels, and the concubines and servants who attended to the needs of the officers. When Xerxes invaded Greece in 480 before Christ, the Immortals marched at the very center of the army, their supply train stretching for miles behind them, their presence a declaration that the great king had come in person, with all the might of his empire, to crush the insolent Greeks who had defied his father. The discipline and the morale of the Immortals were the products of a military culture that valued honor, loyalty, and the fear of disgrace above the fear of death. The Persians, as Herodotus and Xenophon both attest, were a people who despised cowardice and who rewarded courage with public honors, promotions, and gifts of land and gold. The Immortals, who were the embodiment of this ethos, were expected to fight with a bravery that bordered on recklessness, to stand their ground against any odds, and to die rather than retreat without orders. The punishment for cowardice or disobedience was severe: disgrace, degradation, and often a painful death. The reward for valor was equally extreme: the king's favor, a golden cup, a robe of honor, a promotion to a higher rank, and the eternal gratitude of the empire. The Immortals were bound to the king by a personal oath of loyalty, a covenant that was both military and religious, and the breach of this oath was considered a sin against the divine order as well as a crime against the state. The Zoroastrian religion, which the Achaemenid kings patronized, taught that the universe was a battleground between the forces of truth and falsehood, order and chaos, light and darkness, and the warrior who fought for the king was fighting on the side of truth, his death a sacrifice that would be rewarded in the afterlife. The Immortals, who marched into battle with the blessing of the priests and the assurance of paradise, were more than soldiers. They were warriors of the faith, the earthly instruments of Ahura Mazda's will. This fusion of military discipline and religious conviction gave the Immortals a cohesion and a motivation that few ancient armies could match, and it explains, at least in part, why they were able to fight with such tenacity and such discipline even when the battle turned against them. The mechanism of immortality, the continuous replacement of fallen soldiers that gave the corps its Greek name, was the defining feature of the Immortals, the secret of their mystique and the source of their reputation for invincibility. Herodotus, in his description of the corps, explains the system with admirable clarity. Whenever a man died, whether from a wound, a disease, or an accident, another man, already selected and trained, stepped into his place immediately, so that the number of the corps never fell below 10,000. The psychological effect of this system, on both the Immortals themselves and on their enemies, was profound. For the immortal soldier, The knowledge that his death would be instantly filled, that the corps would continue without him, that his sacrifice would not weaken the army or leave his comrades vulnerable, was a source of both comfort and motivation. He did not fight for his own survival. He fought for the honor of the regiment, for the glory of the king, and for the continuity of the empire, a purpose that transcended his individual existence. For the enemy, the Immortals were a terrifying anomaly, an army that could not be diminished, a foe that seemed to rise from the dead, a wall of spears that, no matter how many times it was pierced, always closed again. The Greeks, who fought as citizen soldiers, each man a unique and irreplaceable member of his community, were particularly struck by the contrast between their own mortality and the apparent deathlessness of the Persian elite. The name Athenat, the Immortals, was not a Persian boast, it was a Greek label, born of a mixture of admiration, fear, and resentment, a recognition that the Persians had created something that the Greek city-states, with their small populations and their amateur militias, could never hope to match. The Immortals were a professional army in a world of amateurs, and their ability to absorb casualties without losing their combat effectiveness was a key factor in the military dominance that the Achaemenid Empire enjoyed for 2 centuries. The practical administration of the replacement system was a complex logistical operation that required a large reserve of trained men, a sophisticated system of recruitment and training, and a bureaucratic apparatus that could track the strength of the corps and the availability of replacements in real time. The Persepolis fortification tablets, which record the distribution of rations to workers and soldiers in the region of Persepolis, mention groups of boys and young men who were being trained for service, and it is likely that these were the recruits who would eventually fill the ranks of the Immortals and other elite units. The boys were selected from the noble families of Persia and Media, and they were brought to the court or to regional training centers, where they underwent the rigorous physical and military education that would transform them into professional soldiers. The training was not only military but moral. The boys were taught the principles of Zoroastrian ethics, the duties of loyalty and obedience, and the history and the traditions of the Persian people. The replacement system, in this sense, was not merely a matter of filling a slot with a body. It was a process of initiation, a rite of passage through which a boy became a man and a man became an immortal. The Greek historian Xenophon, who admired the Persian military system, describes a similar process in his Cyropedia, where the young Persian nobles are educated in the Free Agora, a public square where they learn justice, temperance, and the arts of war. The reality may have been less idealized, but the principle is clear. The Immortals were not simply recruited, they were produced through a system of training and indoctrination that ensured that every replacement was as good as the man he replaced. The resilience of the Immortals was demonstrated, in a negative sense, by their performance at the Battle of Thermopylae in 480 before Christ, where they were unable to break the Greek line but where they also did not break themselves, a testament to their discipline under extreme conditions. Herodotus reports that Xerxes, after 2 days of watching his regular troops fail to dislodge the Spartans, ordered the Immortals to attack. The Immortals advanced into the narrow pass, their spears leveled, their bows ready, and they crashed into the Greek phalanx with a shock that must have been felt on both sides. The Spartans, however, executed a feigned retreat, a maneuver that required precise coordination and iron discipline, and when the Immortals pursued, the Spartans turned and cut them down in heaps. The pass was so narrow that only a few men could fight at a time, and the Immortals, unable to deploy their full formation or to use their archery to advantage, were slaughtered in a killing zone where their numbers were meaningless. Herodotus says that many of the Immortals fell, and that they were repeatedly driven back by the Greek counterattacks, but he also notes that they did not flee in panic. They withdrew in good order, their officers maintaining control, their formation intact. This was not the performance of a crack assault unit, it was the performance of a disciplined force that, when confronted with a tactical problem it could not solve, at least did not dissolve into a mob. The Immortals at Thermopylae lost a portion of their number and a great deal of their prestige, but they remained a coherent fighting force, and they would have their revenge at the Battle of Plataea a year later, where they fought with distinction and where their commander, Mardonius, died at the head of his men. The replacement system also had a darker side, a vulnerability that the Greeks did not see but that the Persians themselves must have understood. The Immortals were only as good as the recruitment pipeline that fed them, and in periods of prolonged war or political instability, the pipeline could falter. The Persian nobility, which supplied the officers and the elite of the Immortals, was a limited resource, and the losses of the Persian wars, particularly at Plataea, where the Immortals fought to the death around the body of Mardonius, must have been devastating to the families that provided the corps with its leaders. The replacement of common soldiers was a matter of logistics. The replacement of officers, with their years of training and their personal bonds with the king and the court, was a matter of politics. The Immortals, like any military institution, depended on the continuity of its officer corps, and the decimation of that corps in the Greek wars may have contributed to the decline of the Immortals in the later 5th and 4th centuries before Christ, as the Achaemenid Empire entered a period of internal strife and external pressure. The Immortals did not disappear. They remained the royal guard throughout the remainder of the Achaemenid period, and they are mentioned in the accounts of the campaigns of Darius III against Alexander the Great. But they were never again the instrument of world conquest that they had been under Cyrus and Darius. The replacement system, for all its ingenuity, could not replace the aura of invincibility that had been lost at Thermopylae, and the Immortals, like the empire they served, entered a long, slow decline that would end with the Macedonian spears of Alexander's companions. The role of the Immortals as the king's personal guard and the custodians of the royal person was as important, in the political calculus of the Achaemenid Empire, as their function on the battlefield. The Persian king, unlike the elected generals of the Greek city-states, or the constitutional monarchs of later European history, was an absolute ruler whose person was sacred, whose word was law, and whose survival was essential to the stability of the entire imperial edifice. The empire, as the Persian inscriptions repeatedly proclaim, was a gift of Ahura Mazda to the king, and the king was the earthly representative of the divine order, the pivot on which the cosmos turned. The death of a king in battle or by assassination was not merely a political crisis, it was a cosmic rupture, a moment when the forces of chaos threatened to overwhelm the forces of order, and the history of the Achaemenid dynasty, with its palace conspiracies, its harem poisonings, and its regicides, was a testament to the constant danger that surrounded the throne. The Immortals were the shield that protected the king from this danger, the human wall that stood between the royal person and the daggers of the assassins, the spears of the enemy, and the intrigues of the court. The 1,000 men who carried the golden apples on their spears, the Meliphoroi or apple-bearers, were the innermost circle of this guard, the select few who were permitted to enter the royal presence, to sleep outside the king's tent, and to accompany him on the most intimate occasions of his life. The qualifications for service in this elite of the elite were rigorous: noble birth, physical perfection, proven courage, and absolute, unquestioning loyalty to the king. The Meliphoroi were the king's constant companions, his shadow, his second skin, and their presence was a reminder, to all who approached the throne, that the king was protected by the finest warriors in the empire. The duties of the Immortals in the royal court extended far beyond the simple physical protection of the king. They were the ceremonial guardians of the throne, the men who lined the halls of the palace, who stood motionless for hours during the royal audiences, who accompanied the king on his progresses through the empire, and who presided over the elaborate rituals of the New Year festival and the tribute processions. The reliefs at Persepolis, which depict ranks of guardsmen in Persian and Median dress, are a window into this ceremonial world, a world in which every gesture, every garment, and every weapon was charged with symbolic meaning. The guardsmen on the reliefs are not engaged in combat. They are standing at attention, their spears grounded, their bows slung over their shoulders, their faces turned in profile toward the king or the tribute-bearers who approach the throne. This is the Immortals in their peacetime role, the visible embodiment of the imperial order, a tableau vivant that communicated the power, the wealth, and the invincibility of the Persian state to the ambassadors, the satraps, and the subject peoples who came to Persepolis to pay homage. The ceremonial function of the Immortals was not a secondary or ornamental aspect of their service. It was integral to their identity, and to the ideology of the empire. The king was not merely a man, he was a divine persona, a living god in the language of the Egyptian and Mesopotamian traditions, and the men who guarded him were not merely soldiers. They were acolytes, the ministers of a sacred ritual that maintained the order of the world. The Immortals, in their ceremonial capacity, were the priests of the royal cult, and their discipline on parade was as important as their discipline in battle. The relationship between the king and his Immortals was one of mutual dependence and mutual obligation, a bond that was expressed in the Persian concept of bandaka, a term that encompassed loyalty, fidelity, and personal devotion. The king depended on the Immortals for his safety and his power. The Immortals depended on the king for their status, their wealth, and their identity. The king rewarded his guards with land grants, gifts of gold and silver, promotions to high office, and the honor of personal proximity to the throne. The Immortals, in turn, gave the king their lives, their swords, and their absolute obedience, a contract that was sealed with oaths and sanctified by the gods. The Greek historians, who were fascinated by the Persian court and its elaborate protocols, record numerous anecdotes that illustrate this relationship. Xenophon, in the Cyropedia, describes how Cyrus would personally inspect his guards, reward the diligent, and punish the negligent, a scene that reflects the ideal of the king as the father of his soldiers, the general who knows the names and the deeds of his men. The reality was often less idyllic. The history of the Achaemenid court is a chronicle of betrayals, conspiracies, and coups, many of them involving the very guards who were sworn to protect the king. The assassination of Xerxes, the king who had led the Immortals to Greece, was carried out by the commander of his own guard, Artabanus, a betrayal that shook the empire and inaugurated a period of instability that lasted for decades. The Immortals, like any institution in a despotic monarchy, were both a support and a threat to the king, a force that could protect him or destroy him, depending on the loyalty of their commanders and the vicissitudes of court politics. The presence of the Immortals at the great ceremonies of the Persian court was a spectacle that left a deep impression on all who witnessed it, a display of power and opulence that was deliberately calculated to awe and intimidate. The tribute procession at Persepolis, which is immortalized in the reliefs of the Apodana staircase, was the most important of these ceremonies, an annual ritual in which the delegates of the 23 satrapies brought their gifts to the king, symbolizing the submission of the whole world to the Persian throne. The Immortals, in their full ceremonial regalia, lined the approach to the throne, their spears glittering, their faces expressionless, their presence a silent assertion of the force that backed the king's authority. The ambassadors who climbed those stairs, leading their horses, their camels, and their slaves, bearing their gold, their silver, and their exotic animals, could not fail to notice the ranks of guardsmen who watched them pass, and the message was unmistakable. The king who received these gifts was the master of an army that could crush any rebellion, an army that was represented, in microcosm, by the 10,000 warriors who stood before him. The ceremony was, in a sense, a ritualized version of the military review, a display of the king's power that was designed to overawe the subjects and to reinforce their loyalty. The Immortals, who were the primary actors in this theater of power, were not merely soldiers but performers, men whose discipline and appearance were as much a weapon as their spears and their bows. The court ceremonial of the Achaemenids, with its elaborate protocol, its rigid hierarchy, and its emphasis on the distance between the king and his subjects, was a psychological mechanism of control, and the Immortals were the instruments of that mechanism, the human tools through which the king's majesty was made manifest. The Immortals played a central role in the military campaigns that created and maintained the Achaemenid Empire, from the conquests of Cyrus the Great in the mid-6th century before Christ to the last, desperate battles against Alexander the Great in the 330s before Christ. The earliest battles of the Immortals, if they existed as a formal corps under Cyrus, are not recorded in detail by the surviving sources, but the outlines of their participation can be inferred from the general history of Achaemenid expansion. Cyrus, as we have seen, was a military innovator who transformed the Persian army from a tribal militia into a professional force, and the nucleus of this force, the standing regiment of 10,000 that Xenophon describes, was almost certainly the prototype of the later Immortals. The campaigns that Cyrus waged against the Medes, the Lydians, and the Babylonians were the testing grounds for this new model army, and the Immortals, or their predecessors, would have been at the center of every battle. At the Battle of Tyria in 547 before Christ, where Cyrus fought the Lydian king Croesus to a draw, the Persian infantry stood its ground against the famous Lydian cavalry, a feat that required the discipline and the cohesion of a professional force. At the Battle of Thymbra, later in the same year, Cyrus deployed his infantry in a deep square formation, a tactic that was designed to absorb the charge of the Lydian horse and to protect the baggage train and the camp followers in the center. The Immortals, if they were present, would have formed the core of this square, the steady, unbreakable nucleus around which the rest of the army was arrayed. The conquest of Babylon in 539 before Christ, which was accomplished with minimal bloodshed, was a triumph of strategy and diplomacy rather than a pitched battle, but the presence of the Immortals, the king's own guard, in the streets of the ancient city would have been a powerful symbol of the new order that Cyrus was establishing. The Immortals were, in this sense, the instruments of the Persian peace, the soldiers who made the conquest but also the soldiers who maintained the stability that followed the conquest. The reign of Cambyses II, the son of Cyrus, who ruled from 530 to 522 before Christ, was a period of continued military expansion, most notably the conquest of Egypt in 525 before Christ, a campaign that tested the limits of Persian logistics and the endurance of the Immortals. The invasion of Egypt required the Persian army to cross the Sinai Desert, a waterless waste that had destroyed many armies before them, and the preparations for the crossing, which included securing the cooperation of the Arab tribes who controlled the oases, were a masterpiece of military planning. The Immortals, who marched at the heart of the army, would have suffered from the heat, the thirst, and the constant threat of Bedouin raids, but they emerged from the desert intact, and they played a decisive role in the Battle of Pelusium, where the Egyptian army was routed and the pharaoh Psamtik III was captured. The conquest of Egypt added one of the most ancient and wealthy civilizations to the Persian Empire, and the Immortals, who had crossed the desert and defeated the Egyptians in their own land, returned to Persia with their reputation enhanced. The later years of Cambyses' reign, however, were marred by increasing instability and by the king's erratic behavior, which the Greek sources attribute to madness brought on by the murder of his brother Bardia. The Immortals, as the guardians of the king, were caught up in the palace intrigues that followed Cambyses' death in 522 before Christ, and their loyalty was tested by the succession crisis that engulfed the empire. The crisis of 522 before Christ, which saw the usurpation of the throne by the Magian priest Gaumata, who claimed to be the resurrected Bardia, was the greatest test of the Immortals' discipline and loyalty in their early history. The official Persian version of these events, preserved in the Behistun inscription of Darius the Great, relates that Gaumata seized the throne while Cambyses was in Egypt, and that he was able to win the support of the army and the provinces by abolishing military conscription and granting tax remissions. The Immortals, who were stationed with the king or at the capital, were faced with an agonizing choice: to serve the usurper, whom many of them believed to be the legitimate heir, or to resist and risk the destruction of their core. The Behistun inscription claims that the army and the people went over to Gaumata, and that even the Persian nobility accepted him as king, a testimony to the effectiveness of his propaganda and the fragility of the Achaemenid succession. The conspiracy of the seven nobles, led by Darius and his fellow aristocrats, eventually unmasked the impostor and killed him in the fortress of Sikiavati in Media, and the Immortals, or at least a portion of them, were presumably involved in this coup on one side or the other. The consolidation of Darius's power after the death of Gaumata required the suppression of rebellions in virtually every province of the empire, a series of campaigns that were fought over 18 months and that involved 19 battles against 9 different rebel kings. The Immortals, who had been reconstituted and purged of any disloyal elements by Darius, were the king's mobile reserve during this civil war, the force that he could throw into the most critical battles, the force that never faltered, that never deserted, and that gradually crushed all opposition. The Behistun relief, which shows Darius with his foot on the chest of Gaumata and 9 bound rebels before him, is a visual record of this triumph, and the presence of the king's guardsmen, with their spears and their bows, is implicit in the scene, the silent witnesses to the restoration of order. The reign of Darius I, which lasted from 522 to 486 before Christ, was the golden age of the Immortals, the period when they were expanded, reorganized, and deployed on campaigns that extended the boundaries of the empire from the Indus Valley to the Danube River. Darius was a reformer, an administrator, and a builder, and his reorganization of the empire, which included the division into 20 satrapies, the introduction of the Daric gold coin, and the construction of the royal road, was mirrored by a reorganization of the army that placed the Immortals at the center of the military establishment. The Immortals under Darius were not only a field army, they were a strategic reserve that could be moved rapidly along the imperial roads to any threatened frontier, a force that embodied the mobility and the reach of the Persian state. The Scythian campaign of 513 before Christ, in which Darius led a vast army across the Bosporus and into the steppes of modern Ukraine, was a demonstration of this strategic mobility, a campaign that, while ultimately inconclusive, showed that the Persian army could project power into the most remote and inhospitable regions of the known world. The Immortals, marching across the endless grasslands, harassed by the hit-and-run tactics of the Scythian horsemen, learned the hard lessons of steppe warfare, lessons that would be applied in later campaigns on the eastern and northern frontiers. The Ionian Revolt, which erupted in 499 before Christ and which drew the Persians into a protracted conflict with the Greek cities of Asia Minor, was suppressed with the help of the Immortals, who participated in the capture of Miletus in 494 before Christ, a victory that was followed by the destruction of the city and the deportation of its population. The Immortals, by the end of Darius's reign, had fought on every frontier of the empire, from the deserts of Egypt to the mountains of the Caucasus, and they had acquired a reputation for invincibility that would be put to the ultimate test under Darius's son and successor, Xerxes. The invasion of Greece by Xerxes I in 480 before Christ was the largest military expedition in the history of the world up to that point, and the Immortals, who marched at the very center of the Persian host, were the pride and the terror of the Armada. The preparations for the invasion consumed 4 years and involved the construction of a canal across the isthmus of Mount Athos, the building of 2 pontoon bridges across the Hellespont, and the mustering of contingents from every satrapy of the empire, an army that Herodotus, with his characteristic love of round numbers, estimated at 1,700,000 infantry and 80,000 cavalry. Modern scholars have reduced these figures by a factor of 10 or more, but even a force of 150,000 to 200,000 men was an unprecedented logistical challenge, and the Immortals, who were the professional core of this host, were essential to its cohesion and its morale. The 10,000 Immortals were accompanied by their servants, their wagons, and their families, a mobile city of perhaps 50,000 souls that moved at the center of the Persian column, a spectacle of imperial grandeur that awed the Greek observers who saw it pass. The Immortals were the first to cross the Hellespont after the king himself, their spears gleaming, their armor shining, their step measured and deliberate, a procession that lasted for hours and that was watched by the assembled multitudes of the empire. The army that Xerxes led into Europe was the culmination of 2 centuries of Persian military evolution, and the Immortals, who represented the finest product of that evolution, were confident that no force in the world could stand against them. The Greeks, who had heard terrifying rumors of the approaching host, prepared to resist with a courage that was born of desperation and a tactical doctrine that had been forged in the wars of the city-states, a doctrine that would test the Immortals as they had never been tested before. The Battle of Thermopylae, which we have already described in part, was the first major engagement of the Immortals on Greek soil, and it exposed both the strengths and the limitations of the Persian elite infantry. The narrow pass, which was only a few meters wide at its narrowest point, was a natural fortress that negated the Persian advantage in numbers and forced the Immortals to fight a frontal assault against a heavily armored enemy who was fighting on his own terms. The Immortals, who were accustomed to fighting on open plains where they could deploy their full formation and use their archery to soften up the enemy, were now forced to advance in a narrow column, their shields locked together, their spears leveled, into a wall of Greek bronze. The collision was brutal and bloody. The Greek hoplites, whose spears were longer and whose armor was heavier, had the advantage in the initial impact, and the front ranks of the Immortals were skewered on the Spartan lances before they could bring their own weapons to bear. The discipline of the Immortals, however, prevented a rout. The fallen were dragged back, the gaps were filled, and the column continued to press forward, step by step, over the bodies of the dead and the dying. Herodotus reports that Xerxes, watching from his throne on the hill, leaped up 3 times in anguish as he saw his finest troops thrown back, a reaction that testifies to the shock that the Persian command felt at the failure of the Immortals. The tactical problem was not a lack of courage but a mismatch of equipment and terrain. The Immortals, with their shorter spears and their lighter armor, were simply not designed to fight a phalanx in a narrow pass, and no amount of bravery could overcome that fundamental disadvantage. The Spartan king Leonidas, who commanded the Greek forces, understood this perfectly, and his strategy of holding the pass with a small, elite force was based on the assumption that the Persians, no matter how numerous, could not bring their full strength to bear. The Immortals, after 2 days of fruitless assaults, were eventually able to flank the Greek position through the betrayal of the local guide Ephialtes, who showed them a mountain path that led behind the Greek lines. But their direct assault on the pass had been a failure, and their reputation had suffered a blow from which it would never fully recover. The aftermath of Thermopylae and the subsequent campaign in central Greece revealed the continuing importance of the Immortals to the Persian war effort, despite their setback at the Hot Gates. The Persian army, having broken through the pass and killed Leonidas and his Spartans, poured into central Greece, burning Thespe and Plataea, and then descending upon Athens, which had been evacuated of its population. The Immortals, as the royal guard, were the first to enter the abandoned city, and they participated in the capture and the destruction of the Acropolis, an act of symbolic violence that was intended to avenge the burning of Sardis by the Athenians during the Ionian Revolt. The Immortals, having regained some of their shattered prestige, were then present at the decisive naval battle of Salamis, where they were stationed on the shore as spectators to the disaster that unfolded in the straits. The Persian fleet, which had been lured into the narrow waters by the Athenian admiral Themistocles, was shattered by the Greek triremes, and Xerxes, watching from his throne on Mount Aigailos, saw his navy destroyed and his communications with Asia cut. The Immortals, who had been positioned on the shore to slaughter any Greeks who tried to land, were witnesses to the catastrophe, and their morale, already shaken by Thermopylae, was further depressed by the defeat of the fleet. The retreat of Xerxes and the bulk of the army back to Asia left the Immortals, or a significant portion of them, in Greece under the command of Mardonius, the general who had been the architect of the invasion and who now fought a last, desperate campaign to salvage something from the wreckage. The Battle of Plataea, fought in August 479 before Christ on the plains of Boeotia, was the final, decisive land battle of the Persian Wars, and it was here that the Immortals made their last, heroic stand against the Greek alliance. Mardonius, who commanded an army of perhaps 60,000 to 70,000 men, had chosen a strong defensive position along the Asopus River, and he intended to force the Greeks to attack him on ground of his own choosing. The Greeks, under the Spartan regent Pausanias, maneuvered for days, attempting to find a weakness in the Persian line, and the battle was finally joined after a chaotic night retreat that left the Greek army divided and vulnerable. The Immortals, who formed the center of the Persian line opposite the Spartans, advanced into the gap and engaged the Spartan phalanx in a ferocious, close-quarters struggle that lasted for hours. The fighting around the person of Mardonius, who rode into battle on his white horse and who was cut down by a Spartan named Iamnestus, was the climax of the battle, and the Immortals, who were stationed around their general, fought to the death to protect his body. Herodotus, who interviewed survivors of the battle, describes the carnage with his usual vividness. The Persians, he says, were not a whit inferior in courage and strength, but they were without defensive armor, untrained, and far below the enemy in skill. They would rush out singly or in groups of 10, more or fewer, and charge into the Spartan ranks, and there they would perish. This description, which contrasts the individual bravery of the Persians with the collective discipline of the Greeks, is a fitting epitaph for the Immortals who died at Plataea. The survivors of the corps, who were led back to Asia after the defeat, carried with them the memory of their fallen comrades and the knowledge that the invincibility of the Immortals had been a myth, a myth that had been shattered on the plains of Boeotia. The period between the Persian Wars and the rise of Macedon, from 479 to 350 before Christ, was a long, slow decline for the Achaemenid Empire and for the Immortals who served it. The empire did not collapse after Plataea. It remained the largest and wealthiest state in the world, and the Persian king continued to be a figure of immense power and prestige. But the dynamic, expansionist energy of the 6th and early 5th centuries was gone, replaced by a defensive posture, a chronic instability in the western satrapies, and an increasing reliance on Greek mercenaries to fight the empire's wars. The Immortals, who had been the spearhead of conquest, became the guardians of a status quo, their role shrinking from the conquest of new territories to the suppression of revolts and the defense of the royal person against the ever-present threat of assassination. The court intrigues that had always been a feature of Achaemenid politics intensified during this period, as the harem, the eunuchs, and the noble factions competed for power and influence over weak or vacillating kings. The Immortals, who were stationed at the heart of the court, were inevitably drawn into these intrigues, and their loyalty, which had been the bedrock of the empire's stability, became a commodity that could be bought and sold. The assassination of Xerxes in 465 before Christ by the Chiliarch Artabanus, the commander of the guard, was a watershed event that revealed the extent of the corruption that had infected the highest levels of the imperial administration. The Immortals, who had been created to protect the king, had become the instrument of his destruction, a perversion of their original purpose that was a symptom of the deeper malaise afflicting the empire. The reign of Artaxerxes I, which lasted from 465 to 424 before Christ, saw the gradual recovery of Persian power in the Aegean through the shrewd use of diplomacy and gold, a strategy that avoided the risks of direct military confrontation. The Immortals, during this period, were not deployed on major foreign campaigns but were kept at the court or in the garrison cities of the empire, a standing force that symbolized the continuity of the monarchy even as the satraps and the Greek cities fought their endless wars. The Egyptian revolt of 460 to 454 before Christ, which was supported by an Athenian fleet, was a serious challenge to Persian authority, and the Immortals may have participated in the suppression of this revolt, though the sources are silent on the details. The eventual Persian victory, achieved after years of fighting and at great cost, demonstrated that the empire was still capable of projecting power, but the need to enlist Greek mercenaries and to make concessions to the Egyptian priesthood revealed the limits of the imperial military machine. The Immortals, who had once been the sole reliance of the king in battle, were now just one component of a larger, more complex, and more heterogeneous army, an army that included Greek hoplites, Thracian peltasts, Scythian horse archers, and Indian war elephants, a polyglot force that lacked the cohesion and the shared ethos of the old Persian elite. The revolt of Cyrus the Younger, which erupted in 401 before Christ and which culminated in the Battle of Cunaxa, was a civil war that pitted Persian against Persian and that revealed the deep divisions within the Achaemenid nobility. Cyrus, the younger son of Darius II, had been appointed satrap of Lydia, Cappadocia, and Phrygia, and he had used his position to build up a private army that included 10,000 Greek mercenaries, the famous 10,000 of Xenophon's Anabasis. The revolt was a direct challenge to the legitimacy of Cyrus's elder brother, Artaxerxes II, who had succeeded to the throne in 404 before Christ, and the Battle of Cunaxa was a contest for the soul of the empire, a battle in which the Immortals, or at least a portion of them, fought on both sides. The king's army, which included a contingent of Immortals under the command of the Chiliarch Tissaphernes, faced the rebel army on the plain of Cunaxa, about 70 kilometers north of Babylon. The Greek mercenaries, who were deployed on the rebel right wing, shattered the Persian left wing facing them, but in the center, Cyrus, seeing his brother's royal standard, charged directly at Artaxerxes with a small bodyguard. The Immortals who were guarding the king fought desperately to protect him, and in the chaos of the melee, Cyrus was killed by a javelin, his rebellion dying with him. The aftermath of Cunaxa was a purge of the rebel faction and a reaffirmation of the authority of Artaxerxes II, but the battle had demonstrated, yet again, that the Immortals were not invincible, and that the fate of the empire could be decided by a single, reckless charge. The 10,000 Greek mercenaries, who had fought for Cyrus and who were now stranded in the heart of the Persian Empire, fought their way back to the Black Sea through some of the most hostile terrain in the world, a feat that exposed the vulnerability of the Persian interior and that would inspire the future conqueror, Alexander of Macedon. The later years of the Achaemenid Empire, from the reign of Artaxerxes III in the mid-4th century before Christ to the final collapse under Darius III in 330 before Christ, were a period of temporary recovery followed by catastrophic defeat. Artaxerxes III, who was a ruler of the old school, reconquered Egypt in 343 before Christ after a campaign that had been prepared for years and that involved the largest Persian army since the invasion of Greece. The Immortals, who had been reconstituted and re-equipped by the king, participated in this campaign and regained some of their lost luster, but the reconquest was accompanied by atrocities that alienated the Egyptian population and that sowed the seeds of future revolts. The reign of Artaxerxes III was cut short by poison, administered by his own chiliarch, Bagoas, who then installed the king's youngest son, Arses, as a puppet, only to murder him 2 years later and replace him with a distant cousin, Codomanus, who took the throne as Darius III in 336 before Christ. The empire that Darius III inherited was a hollow shell, its treasury depleted, its army demoralized, and its satraps semi-independent. The Immortals, who had survived the intrigues and the purges of the previous decades, were still a formidable force on paper, but their equipment, their training, and their morale were not what they had been in the days of Cyrus and Darius the Great. The Macedonian storm, which was gathering across the Aegean under the leadership of Philip II and his son Alexander, would test the Immortals for the last time, and the battles of Granicus, Issus, and Gaugamela would write the final chapter of their history. The conquests of Alexander the Great and the final destruction of the Achaemenid Empire in a series of lightning campaigns between 334 and 330 before Christ were the ultimate test of the Immortals, a test that they failed, but not without a fight that earned the respect of their Macedonian conquerors. The Macedonian army that crossed the Hellespont in the spring of 334 before Christ was the most professional, the best equipped, and the best led force that the ancient world had yet seen, the product of the military reforms of Philip II and the tactical genius of his son. The core of this army was the phalanx of the foot companions, the Pezzatera, who were armed with the sarissa, a pike that was up to 18 feet long, twice the length of the Greek dory and 3 times the length of the Persian spear. The Macedonian phalanx, when properly deployed, was a hedgehog of iron points that no infantry in the world could break, and the Immortals, who had struggled against the shorter spears of the Spartan hoplites, were now facing an enemy that could kill them before they could even get within striking distance. The Persians, who had relied for centuries on the superiority of their cavalry, their archery, and their numbers, were confronted with an army that was superior in every arm, an army that combined the mobility of the light infantry and the shock of the heavy cavalry with the irresistible pressure of the phalanx. The Immortals, who were the best infantry that the Persian Empire could field, were forced to fight against a tactical system that had been designed, in part, to defeat them, and the results were predictable. The Battle of the Granicus River, fought in May 334 before Christ in northwestern Anatolia, was the first major engagement between Alexander and the Persian satrapal army, and the Immortals, or at least a portion of them, were present in the Persian line. The battle was primarily a cavalry engagement, with the Macedonian companions charging across the river and breaking the Persian horse, but the Greek mercenaries who formed the Persian infantry were surrounded and slaughtered after the cavalry had fled. The Immortals, who are not mentioned by name in the sources for this battle, may have been deployed elsewhere, or they may have been among the Persian infantry that did not engage. The defeat at Granicus opened Asia Minor to Alexander, and the Persian king, Darius III, realized that he would have to take personal command of the army and bring the full weight of the empire to bear if he was to stop the Macedonian advance. The mobilization that followed was the largest since the days of Xerxes, and the Immortals, who were recalled from their garrisons and re-equipped for the coming campaign, were at the center of the host that Darius assembled at Babylon. The Persian army that marched westward to confront Alexander included not only the Immortals but also the Cardaques, A new corps of heavy infantry that had been trained and equipped to fight in a Macedonian style, a desperate attempt to match the enemy's tactics that would ultimately prove inadequate. The stage was set for a battle that would decide the fate of the empire. The Battle of Issus, fought in November 333 before Christ on a narrow coastal plain near the modern border of Turkey and Syria, was the first direct confrontation between Alexander and Darius, and it was a disaster for the Persians that rivaled Salamis in its magnitude. Darius, who had chosen a strong defensive position behind the Panaris River, deployed his army with the Immortals in the center, where they would face the Macedonian phalanx. The Immortals, who were now facing the Sarissa-armed foot companions, were equipped with their traditional weapons, the short spear, the bow, and the wicker shield, and they were at a severe disadvantage in reach and armor. The Macedonian phalanx, advancing with its pikes leveled, pressed the Persian center back, and the Immortals, despite their discipline and their courage, were unable to close the gap and bring their shorter weapons to bear. The real disaster, however, occurred on the Persian left, where Alexander led the companion cavalry in a charge that broke through the Persian flank and drove directly at the person of Darius himself. The great king, seeing the golden-helmeted figure of Alexander bearing down on him, lost his nerve and fled the battlefield in his chariot, abandoning his army and his family. The Immortals, who were fighting for their lives in the center, saw the royal standard retreat, and their morale, which had been wavering, collapsed. The rout that followed was a slaughter, with thousands of Persians cut down by the pursuing Macedonians, and the Immortals, who fought a rearguard action to cover the king's flight, suffered heavy losses. The survivors, who staggered back to Babylon with the remnants of Darius's army, were the witnesses to the end of an era. The final battle of Gaugamela, fought on October 1, 331 before Christ on a vast plain near the ancient Assyrian city of Arbela, was the last stand of the Achaemenid Empire, and the Immortals, who were present in the Persian line, fought with a desperation that was born of the knowledge that this was the end. Darius had assembled the largest army of his reign, perhaps 100,000 men, with war elephants, scythe chariots, and the best cavalry that the empire could muster, and he had chosen a battlefield that had been leveled and cleared to give his chariots a free run. The Immortals, who were stationed in the center around the king, were the last line of defense, the men who would live or die with Darius. The battle began with a massive assault on both Macedonian wings, and for a time, the Persian left, under the command of the satrap Mazias, drove the Macedonian flank back and penetrated the baggage camp. But Alexander, on the Macedonian right, was executing his masterstroke, a diagonal advance that opened a gap in the Persian center, and then a sudden, violent charge with the companion cavalry directly into that gap. The Immortals, who saw the charge coming, braced their shields and leveled their spears, but the momentum of the Macedonian heavy horse, with Alexander at its head, was irresistible. The Persian line was pierced, the Immortals were scattered, and Darius, once again, fled the battlefield. The Immortals, or what was left of them, fought on until the rout was general, and then they died, most of them, around the empty chariot of the king they had sworn to protect. The pursuit of the fleeing Persians continued until sunset, and the bodies of the fallen lay thick across the plain, the golden apples of the Immortals' spears glinting among the dead. The Achaemenid Empire, which had stood for 220 years, was ended, and the Immortals, who had been its pride and its terror, were no more. The disappearance of the Immortals as a distinct corps after the death of Darius III and the collapse of the Achaemenid state did not mean the end of their influence. The legend of the Immortals, nurtured by the Greek historians and passed down through the centuries, continued to inspire and to intimidate, and the military institutions that Alexander and his successors established in the former Persian territories owed a debt to the Achaemenid model of a professional, standing army. Alexander himself, who had defeated the Immortals in battle, was deeply impressed by the Persian military tradition, and in the final years of his life, after his return from India, he embarked on a policy of fusion that aimed to combine the best elements of the Macedonian and Persian armies into a single, unified force. The 30,000 Persian youths whom Alexander ordered to be trained in the Macedonian style, the Epigoni, or successors, were a direct attempt to recreate the Immortals as a Macedonian-equipped, Persian Manned Infantry Corps, a project that was cut short by Alexander's death in Babylon in 323 before Christ. The Epigoni, who were trained in the use of the sarissa and the Macedonian shield, were the last echo of the Immortals, a failed experiment that reflected the conqueror's recognition that the Persian military tradition was too valuable to be discarded. The Seleucid Empire, which inherited the bulk of Alexander's Asian territories, continued to employ Persian and Iranian soldiers in its armies, and the Parthian Empire, which rose to power in Iran in the 3rd century before Christ and which challenged Rome for control of the Near East, revived many of the military traditions of the Achaemenid period, including the use of a heavily armored cavalry and a corps of professional infantry. The Parthian royal guard, the corps of the king's kinsmen and the nobles who served as his bodyguards and his shock troops, was a direct descendant of the Immortals, a continuation of the Iranian tradition of an elite, permanent force that was loyal to the person of the king. The Parthians, however, were primarily a cavalry power, and their infantry never achieved the prominence or the reputation of the Achaemenid Immortals. The Sasanian Empire, which overthrew the Parthians in 224 after Christ and which ruled Iran until the Islamic conquest in the 7th century, was a conscious revival of the Achaemenid legacy, and the Sasanian kings, who styled themselves as the heirs of Darius and Xerxes, created a standing army that included an elite corps of heavy infantry, the Daylamites, and a royal guard of cataphracts, the Zaidin, who were the Immortals reborn. The Zaidin, whose name means Immortals, in Middle Persian, were a corps of 10,000 elite cavalry, heavily armored and disciplined, who served as the king's bodyguard and as the core of the Sasanian army, a direct and deliberate imitation of the Achaemenid model. The Sasanian Immortals fought against the Romans, the Byzantines, and the Arabs, and they were destroyed, along with the Sasanian Empire, at the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah in 636 after Christ, a battle that marked the end of ancient Iran and the beginning of the Islamic era. The memory of the Achaemenid Immortals was preserved not only in the Iranian tradition but in the Western imagination, through the works of the Greek and Roman historians who were the primary sources for the history of the Persian Empire. Herodotus's description of the Immortals, with their gold and silver apples, their scale armor, and their invincible discipline, was read and reread throughout antiquity and the Middle Ages, and it became the archetype of the elite warrior corps that appears in the literature and the art of the West. The Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus, who wrote in the 4th century after Christ, compared the heavy cavalry of the Sasanian Persians to the Immortals of old, and the Byzantine historians continued to use the term Athanaut to describe the imperial guard. The Renaissance, with its revival of classical learning, brought Herodotus and Xenophon back into wide circulation, and the image of the Immortals, the 10,000 warriors who could not die, entered the cultural lexicon of early modern Europe. The military theorists of the 17th and 18th centuries, who studied the ancient battles for lessons in strategy and tactics, were fascinated by the Persian army and its elite corps, and the concept of a permanent, professional army, which was the foundation of the modern military state, owed a debt to the Achaemenid model that was acknowledged by the founding fathers of modern warfare, including Maurice of Nassau and Frederick the Great. The depiction of the Immortals in modern popular culture, from the films and graphic novels of the Frank Miller, 300, franchise to the video games of the Assassin's Creed and Civilization series, is a testament to the enduring power of the image that Herodotus created 2.5 millennia ago. The film, 300, which is based on Miller's graphic novel, presents the Immortals as monstrous, masked, almost inhuman figures, a distortion of the historical reality that serves the film's fantasy aesthetic but that also captures something of the terror and the mystique that the Immortals must have inspired in their enemies. The academic debate over the historical accuracy of the Immortals, which we have touched upon throughout this documentary, is a microcosm of the larger debate over the relationship between the Greek sources and the Persian reality, a debate that is central to the modern historiography of the Achaemenid Empire. The pendulum of scholarly opinion, which swung in the late 20th century toward a skepticism that questioned the very existence of the Immortals, has more recently swung back toward a qualified acceptance of the Greek accounts, as the archaeological evidence for the Persian army has accumulated and as the study of the Persepolis tablets has revealed the bureaucratic sophistication that made a standing professional court possible. The Immortals, like the empire they served, are a historical reality that has been refracted through the lens of Greek literature and modern fantasy, a reality that is both more complex and more fascinating than the legend. The legacy of the Immortals for the understanding of ancient Persian civilization is that they were not an aberration, a freakish exception to the rule of Oriental despotism, but the logical expression of the Achaemenid state, an institution that embodied the empire's strengths and its weaknesses, its capacity for order and its propensity for violence, its tolerance and its authoritarianism. The Immortals were the creation of a monarchy that understood that power, to be stable, must be institutionalized, that loyalty, to be reliable, must be cultivated, and that an empire, to be durable, must be defended by men who have a stake in its survival. The 10,000 warriors who carried the silver and the golden apples were more than soldiers. They were the pillars of the imperial order, the human foundation on which the throne of the King of Kings rested. Their story, from the conquests of Cyrus to the last stand at Gaugamela, is the story of the Persian Empire itself, in its glory and its ruin, its triumph and its tragedy. The material culture of the Immortals, the physical objects that survive in museums and archaeological sites, is a fragmentary but precious record of the reality behind the Greek descriptions, a reality that can be pieced together from the reliefs, the glazed bricks, the metalwork, and the seals that have been recovered from the ruins of the Achaemenid capitals. The most vivid and detailed representations of the Persian royal guards come from the palace of Darius I at Susa, where a series of glazed brick friezes, now housed in the Louvre Museum in Paris, depict a procession of guardsmen in full ceremonial dress. The Susa guardsmen, who are sometimes identified with the Immortals, are shown in two alternating groups. One group wears the Persian court dress, a long, pleated robe and a fluted felt cap, while the other wears the Median costume, a knee-length tunic over trousers and a rounded cap with a neck guard. Both groups are armed with a bow, a spear, and a quiver, and their facial features, with their large eyes, their straight noses, and their carefully curled beards, conform to the Achaemenid artistic canon. The precision and the uniformity of the friezes, which were produced by a team of artisans using molds and standardized pigments, is a visual analog of the discipline and the uniformity of the guards themselves, a translation of military order into the language of art. The friezes are not realistic portraits. They are idealized representations, designed to convey the power and the majesty of the king and his court, but they are also a source of technical information about the weapons, the clothing, and the physical appearance of the men who guarded the king. The spears that the guardsmen carry are tipped with metal points and have a bulbous counterweight at the butt. The golden apples or pomegranates of Herodotus's description, a detail that confirms the accuracy of the Greek account on this specific point. The reliefs at Persepolis, which cover the walls of the Apodanos staircase and the doorways of the private palaces, provide additional visual evidence for the appearance and the equipment of the Persian royal guard. The guardsmen on the Persepolis reliefs are shown standing in profile, their spears grounded, their bows and quivers slung over their shoulders, their hands sometimes clasped in a gesture of respect or prayer. They are depicted in two distinct types, the Persian and the Median, and the alternation of the two types, which is a consistent feature of Achaemenid royal iconography, is a symbolic representation of the dual nature of the empire, a partnership between the Persians and the Medes that was the foundation of the Achaemenid political order. The Persepolis reliefs, which were carved from the dark gray limestone of the mountain and which still bear traces of the original paint and gilding, are among the masterpieces of ancient art, and their depiction of the royal guards is a precious document of the visual culture of the Achaemenid court. The guardsmen on the reliefs are not shown in combat. They are shown in the context of the court ceremonial, the audience with the king, the tribute procession, the ritual of the new year. This emphasis on the peacetime, ceremonial role of the guards is a reminder that the Immortals, whatever their function on the battlefield, were also, and perhaps primarily, the custodians of the royal presence, the men whose duty was to embody the majesty and the inviolability of the king. The archaeological evidence for the weapons and the armor of the Immortals is less abundant than the pictorial evidence, but the excavations at Persepolis, Susa, and other Achaemenid sites have yielded a number of artifacts that can be associated with the royal guard. Iron and bronze spearheads, some of them with the remains of the wooden shafts still attached, have been found in the destruction layers of the palaces, and their dimensions correspond to the short spears that Herodotus describes. Fragments of scale armor, made of iron and bronze, have been recovered from several sites, and their design, with small, overlapping scales sewn onto a leather backing, matches the fish scale armor of the Greek accounts. Arrowheads of bronze and iron, of the type used by the Persian archers, are common finds on Achaemenid battlefields and garrison sites, and their distribution provides a map of the Persian military presence across the empire. The akinakes, the short sword of the Persians, has been found in a number of examples, often with elaborate gold and ivory fittings that indicate the high status of their owners, and the distinctive shape of the blade, with its straight edges and its pointed tip, is a classic example of Achaemenid metalwork. These artifacts, scattered across museums from Tehran to London, are the tangible remnants of the Immortals, the physical traces of the men who carried the golden apples and who died at Thermopylae and Gaugamela. The administrative documents from Persepolis, the thousands of clay tablets that record the daily operations of the imperial court, provide a different kind of evidence for the Immortals, a glimpse into the bureaucratic machinery that sustained the core and that made the replacement system possible. The tablets, which are written in Elamite, the administrative language of the Persian court, record the distribution of rations of grain, wine, beer, and oil to various groups of workers and soldiers, and among these groups are the Persians and the Medes, who are listed as receiving regular provisions. The tablets do not name the Immortals directly, but the quantities of rations that are issued to certain groups, and the titles that are used to designate their recipients, suggest that the court maintained a large, permanent military establishment that included the royal guard. The ration lists provide a detailed picture of the diet of the Persian soldier, a diet that included wheat and barley, sheep and goats, wine and beer, and the fruits and vegetables that were grown in the royal gardens. The tablets also record the issuance of special rations for festivals and royal celebrations, occasions when the king would distribute food and drink to his guards as a mark of his favor and a reward for their loyalty. The bureaucratic culture of the Achaemenid court, with its obsession with counting, recording, and auditing, was the foundation on which the Immortals rested, the administrative system that ensured that the 10,000 men were always fed, always paid, and always ready for war. The disappearance of this bureaucratic culture after the fall of the empire is one of the reasons why the Immortals, who were so visible in their own time, have become so shadowy and elusive to the modern historian. The numismatic evidence, the coins that were minted by the Achaemenid kings and their satraps, also contributes to the picture of the Immortals, though indirectly. The daric, the gold coin of the Persian Empire, featured the image of a running archer, a figure that is often interpreted as a representation of the king himself, but that may also be a generic representation of the Persian warrior. The archer on the daric is shown in a kneeling running position, his bow drawn, his quiver on his back, a posture that emphasizes the archery that was the traditional Persian military skill. The silver siglos, which was the common currency of the empire, also featured the image of the archer, though the design varied from region to region and from period to period. The coins, which circulated throughout the empire and beyond, were a medium of propaganda as well as a medium of exchange, and the image of the warrior that they carried was a constant reminder of the military power that stood behind the Persian state. The Immortals, who were the elite of that military power, were not depicted on the coins, but the archer that appears on every daric was the symbol of the warrior culture that produced the Immortals, a culture that valued the bow and the spear, the horse and the truth, the loyalty and the discipline that were the foundations of Persian military might. The comparison between the Immortals and other elite military units of the ancient world, the Spartan Hippias, the Theban Sacred Band, the Macedonian Companion Cavalry, and the Roman Praetorian Guard, illuminates both the unique features of the Persian corps and the common characteristics that define elite forces across time and space. The Spartan Hippias, the 300 knights who formed the king's bodyguard and who fought at Thermopylae under Leonidas, were, like the Immortals, a permanent, professional unit selected for their courage and their physical fitness. But the Hippias were an aristocracy of birth as well as of merit, a corps that was drawn from the highest ranks of Spartan society, and their primary function was to protect the king in battle, not to serve as the heavy infantry of the army. The Theban sacred band, the 300 men who were paired in a relationship of lover and beloved, was a small, shock unit that was designed to punch through the enemy line, a tactical instrument that was used with devastating effect at the battles of Leuctra and Mantinea. The sacred band, however, was a local force, recruited from a single city, and it never achieved the size or the institutional permanence of the Immortals. The Macedonian companion cavalry, the Hetaira, who rode with Alexander and who delivered the decisive charge at Gaugamela, were an elite of birth and friendship, the sons of the Macedonian nobility who had been raised with the king and who were bound to him by ties of personal loyalty. The companions, like the Immortals, were a permanent, professional corps, and their tactical role as the shock arm of the army was similar to the role that the Immortals had played in the Persian battle line, but their equipment, their tactics, and their ethos were fundamentally different, reflecting the different military traditions of Greece and Persia. The Roman Praetorian Guard, which was established by Augustus in 27 before Christ and which survived until the 4th century after Christ, was the most direct heir of the Immortals, a permanent, professional corps of elite soldiers who were stationed in the capital, who enjoyed special privileges and higher pay, and who served as the bodyguards of the emperor. The Praetorians, like the Immortals, became a political force in their own right, making and unmaking emperors, and their corruption and their eventual disbandment by Constantine the Great are a cautionary tale about the dangers of a standing army that is too close to the throne. The comparison of these elite units reveals a pattern that is common to all of them: the combination of privilege and responsibility, the tension between military effectiveness and political ambition, and the dependence of the corps on the character and the authority of the leader who commands them. The evolution of elite forces in the medieval and modern periods, from the Varangian Guard of the Byzantine emperors to the Janissaries of the Ottoman sultans, from the Swiss Guard of the Vatican to the special forces of the modern nation-state, continues the tradition that the Immortals inaugurated, the tradition of a permanent, professional unit that is selected, trained, and equipped to a higher standard than the rest of the army. The Varangians, the Norse and Anglo-Saxon mercenaries who guarded the Byzantine emperors, were renowned for their size, their strength, and their ferocity, and their loyalty, which was purchased with gold and privilege, was legendary. The Janissaries, the slave soldiers of the Ottoman Empire, were recruited from Christian boys, converted to Islam, and trained as an elite infantry corps that was the terror of Europe for centuries, until they, like the Praetorians before them, became a corrupt and obstructive force that was eventually destroyed by the Sultan they were supposed to serve. The Swiss Guard, with their brightly colored uniforms and their halberds, are a surviving example of a royal guard that has retained its ceremonial function while also serving as a modern security force, a direct descendant of the Immortals in their role as the custodians of the king's person. The modern special forces, the SAS, the Navy SEALs, the Spetsnaz, are the functional equivalents of the Immortals, small, highly trained units that are capable of operating independently, that are given the most dangerous and sensitive missions, and that are sustained by a mystique that is carefully cultivated and ferociously defended. The Immortals, who were the first of this long line, invented the concept of the elite warrior as a permanent institution, and their influence, however indirect, can be traced in the history of every subsequent special force. The enduring fascination of the Immortals, which has made them a fixture of popular culture and a subject of endless academic debate, is a reflection of the human attraction to the idea of the invincible warrior, the man who cannot be killed, the army that cannot be defeated. The Immortals, in the Greek imagination, were a kind of monster, a mechanical horde that reproduced itself by absorbing its own dead, a nightmare of perpetual war that was the antithesis of the Greek ideal of the citizen soldier who fought for his own city and his own honor. The reality, as we have seen, was both more human and more complex. The Immortals were not monsters but men who trained and fought and died for the glory of their king and the stability of their empire. Men who were as brave and as disciplined as any soldiers in history, and whose limitations, when they confronted a tactical system that was designed to defeat them, were the limitations of any human institution. The story of the Immortals, like the story of the Persian Empire, is a tragedy in the classical sense, the tale of a great power that rose to dominance through innovation and discipline and that fell because it could not adapt to a changing world. The golden apples that gleamed on the spears of the Immortals are tarnished now, and the men who carried them are dust, but their legacy, the idea that an army can be more than a collection of individuals, that discipline and loyalty can create a force that seems, to the enemy, to be immortal, lives on. The long reign of Artaxerxes I, from 465 to 424 before Christ, was a period of strategic recalibration for the Achaemenid Empire after the twin disasters of the Persian Wars, and for the Immortals it was an era of rebuilding their shattered ranks, re-equipping their depleted companies, and redefining their role in an empire that had shifted from offense to defense. The losses at Plataea and Salamis had fallen disproportionately on the Persian noble houses, the very families that supplied the officers and the elite of the Immortals, and the core that had once been the invincible spearhead of imperial expansion was now a shadow of its former self, its numbers replenished with new recruits who lacked the battle experience and the institutional memory of their fallen predecessors. Artaxerxes, who had come to the throne through a palace coup that had seen his father Xerxes and his elder brother Darius murdered by the Chiliarch Artabanus, understood the political danger of a weakened royal guard, and he invested considerable resources in restoring the Immortals to their former strength and prestige. The Persian court at Susa and Persepolis, which had been convulsed by the assassinations and purges that accompanied the transition of power, needed the visible symbol of the royal guard to project stability, and the Immortals, with their golden apples and their silver spears, were that symbol. The reign of Artaxerxes also saw the increasing employment of Greek mercenaries in the Persian army, a trend that would eventually transform the military landscape of the empire and reduce the relative importance of the native Persian infantry. The Immortals, who were the embodiment of the old Persian military tradition, found themselves fighting alongside hoplites from Athens, Sparta, and Thebes, men who had been their mortal enemies at Thermopylae and Plataea. And the irony of this situation was not lost on the Greek observers who recorded the history of the period. The Persian Empire, which had once sought to conquer Greece, was now paying Greeks to fight its wars, and the Immortals, who had once been the terror of the Greek world, were now sharing the battlefield with the very soldiers who had shattered their mystique. The diplomatic and financial maneuvering that characterized Artaxerxes' Greek policy, the famous King's Peace of 387 before Christ that was actually concluded under his successor Artaxerxes II, was a recognition that the Persian army, despite the restoration of the Immortals, could not defeat the Greek hoplites in a straight fight, and that gold was a more effective weapon than iron. The Immortals, during these decades, were not idle. They were deployed on campaigns in the eastern satrapies, where the nomadic tribes of the Central Asian steppes posed a constant threat to the frontier, and they were used to suppress the revolts that periodically erupted in Egypt and Cyprus. The eastern frontier, which stretched from the Caspian Sea to the Hindu Kush, was a theater of war that was very different from the narrow valleys of Greece, a vast, open landscape where the Persian cavalry and the mobile infantry of the Immortals could operate to their full advantage. The Scythian and Bactrian horsemen who raided the Persian settlements were formidable opponents, but they lacked the discipline and the organization of a professional army, and the Immortals, who had learned the lessons of steppe warfare during the Scythian campaign of Darius I, were able to hold their own against these elusive enemies. The garrisons that were established along the eastern frontier, the fortresses that guarded the passes through the Hindu Kush, and the military colonies that were planted in the fertile valleys of Bactria and Sogdiana were manned by Persian soldiers, many of them veterans of the Immortals, who brought their families and their traditions to the farthest edge of the empire. The Immortals, in this context, were not only a field army but a colonial force, a tool of imperial integration that spread Persian culture and Persian loyalty to the remote provinces, a function that was as important as their role in battle. The eastern frontier was also the source of the finest horses and the best cavalry in the empire, and the Immortals, who were primarily an infantry corps, often fought in conjunction with the Bactrian and Sogdian horsemen who were the elite of the Persian cavalry, a combined arms partnership that was the traditional strength of the Achaemenid military. The reign of Darius II, who ruled from 423 to 404 before Christ, was a period of internal decay and external pressure that tested the loyalty, and the discipline of the Immortals, as they had not been tested since the succession crisis of 522 before Christ. Darius, who was originally named Achuz, was a bastard son of Artaxerxes I, and his rise to power was a bloody affair that involved the murder of his half-brothers and the suppression of a revolt by his full brother Arcides. The Immortals, who were stationed at the court and who were under the command of the Chiliarch, were inevitably drawn into these dynastic struggles, and their role as the king's bodyguard became a political liability as well as a military asset. The Queen Persides, the half-sister and wife of Darius II, was a dominant figure in the court, a ruthless and intelligent woman who manipulated the harem, the eunuchs, and the guards to advance the interests of her favorite son, Cyrus the Younger. The Immortals, who were sworn to protect the king, found themselves caught between the competing factions of the royal family, and their cohesion, which depended on a clear chain of command and an unquestioned loyalty to the throne, was eroded by the corrosive atmosphere of suspicion and intrigue. The revolt of Egypt, which broke out in 411 before Christ and which was not fully suppressed until the reign of Artaxerxes III, was a symptom of the empire's weakness, a sign that the subject peoples no longer feared the Persian army as they had in the days of Cyrus and Darius. The Immortals, who were sent to Egypt as part of the expeditionary forces that attempted to reconquer the Nile Valley, found themselves fighting a guerrilla war against a determined and well-organized enemy, a war that they were not equipped to win. The Egyptian rebels, who were supported by Greek mercenaries and by the difficult terrain of the Delta, held out for decades, and the Immortals, who suffered heavy losses in the swamps and the canals of the Nile, returned to Persia with their reputation further diminished. The accession of Artaxerxes II in 404 before Christ, after the death of Darius II and the brief, contested reign of his elder son Arsaces, inaugurated a long but troubled reign that was dominated by the rebellion of Cyrus the Younger, the disastrous campaign of the 10,000 Greek mercenaries, and the gradual loss of Egypt to a native dynasty. The revolt of Cyrus, which we have already discussed in the context of the Battle of Cunaxa, was a traumatic event for the Immortals, because it forced them to fight against their own countrymen, against the Greek mercenaries who were the best soldiers in the world, and against the claimant to the throne who was, in the eyes of many, the legitimate king. The Immortals who fought for Artaxerxes at Cunaxa were the loyalist faction, the men who had remained true to the reigning king and who had accepted the legitimacy of his succession, but their comrades who had followed Cyrus were also Immortals, or at least men who had been trained in the same tradition, and the fratricidal nature of the battle was a wound that would not heal. The death of Cyrus on the field of Cunaxa, and the subsequent retreat of the 10,000 under the command of Xenophon, exposed the vulnerability of the Persian interior and demonstrated, to any Greek who cared to read Xenophon's account, that the Persian Empire was a colossus with feet of clay, an empire that could be traversed from end to end by a determined army of Greek hoplites. The Immortals, who had been unable to prevent the retreat or to destroy the 10,000, were humiliated, and their prestige, which had been the foundation of their mystique, was irrevocably damaged. The long reign of Artaxerxes II, which lasted until 358 before Christ, was a period of stagnation and decline for the Persian military, as the empire relied increasingly on Greek mercenaries and on the diplomacy of gold to maintain its position, and the Immortals, who were the symbol of the old Persian military tradition, became an anachronism, a relic of a bygone age of conquest. The reforms that Artaxerxes II attempted to implement in the latter part of his reign, including the reorganization of the satrapies and the strengthening of the central administration, did not address the fundamental problem of the army, its dependence on a feudal levy of noble retainers and its inability to match the tactical and technological innovations of the Greek world. The Immortals, who were still recruited from the Persian nobility and still equipped with the traditional weapons of the spear, the bow, and the wicker shield, were no longer a match for the phalanx of the Greek hoplites, and the Persian kings, who were acutely aware of this disparity, responded not by reforming the Immortals but by hiring Greek mercenaries to do the fighting that the Immortals could no longer do. The core of the Immortals, in this period, became a ceremonial force, a guard that was seen on the parade ground and in the audience hall but that was rarely committed to the decisive point of the battle. The 10,000 men who carried the golden and the silver apples were still a magnificent sight, their scale armor still glittering, their spears still sharp. But their fighting spirit, the ethos of the warrior that had been the soul of the corps, had been eroded by decades of court intrigue and military humiliation. The decline of the Immortals was a mirror of the decline of the Empire, a process that was slow and imperceptible at first but that accelerated as the 4th century before Christ wore on, until the arrival of the Macedonian storm swept the entire edifice away. The reign of Artaxerxes III Achus, which began in 358 before Christ after a violent purge of the remaining princes of the blood, was the last, brief resurgence of Achaemenid military power before the final collapse, and it was during this reign that the Immortals were reconstituted, re-equipped, and deployed on the campaign that would be their last great triumph, the reconquest of Egypt. Artaxerxes III was a king of the old school, a ruthless and energetic ruler who understood that the survival of the empire depended on the restoration of its military might, and he set about the task with a single-minded determination that recalled the great kings of the past. The Immortals, who had been allowed to decline under his father Artaxerxes II, were purged of the corrupt and the incompetent, their ranks were filled with the sons of the loyal nobility, and their training was intensified under the supervision of experienced officers who had been recalled from the frontiers. The equipment of the Immortals was updated, with more emphasis on the heavy spear and the metal helmet, and their tactical doctrine was revised to meet the challenge of the Greek hoplites, whom the Persians had learned to respect and to fear. The Kardaiks, a new corps of heavy infantry that was armed and trained in the Macedonian style, were created during this period, and the Immortals, who had once been the sole elite infantry of the empire, now fought alongside these new troops, a combination of the old Persian tradition and the new tactical necessity. Artaxerxes III, who had no illusions about the difficulty of reconquering Egypt, which had been independent for over 60 years, spent 7 years preparing for the invasion, assembling a vast army, building a fleet, and securing the cooperation of the Greek mercenaries who were essential to the success of the campaign. The Immortals, who were the heart of this army, marched westward from Persepolis and Susa, across the Tigris and the Euphrates, through the Syrian desert and the Sinai Peninsula, a march that recalled the great expeditions of Darius and Xerxes, and their spirits were high with the promise of victory and the restoration of their lost glory. The Egyptian campaign of 343 before Christ was a military masterpiece, a demonstration of the logistical and tactical capabilities that the Persian army still possessed when it was properly led and properly motivated. The pharaoh Nectanebo II, who had repelled an earlier Persian invasion in 351 before Christ, had fortified the mouths of the Nile and had hired a large force of Greek mercenaries to defend his kingdom. But he was outmaneuvered and outfought by the Persian commanders, the eunuch Bagoas and the Rhodian mercenary Mentor. The Immortals, who were deployed in the vanguard of the Persian army, stormed the fortress of Pelusium after a siege, and they fought their way through the delta, driving the Egyptian forces back toward Memphis. The Battle of Memphis was the decisive engagement of the campaign, a brutal, close-quarter struggle in which the Immortals, fighting alongside the Greek mercenaries and the Kardaiks, broke the Egyptian line and captured the city. Nectanebo II fled to Nubia, and Egypt, after 62 years of independence, was once again a Persian satrapy. The Immortals, who had suffered heavy casualties in the fighting, had regained their honor, and they returned to Persia with the spoils of Egypt, their spears adorned with the gold and the silver of the pharaohs. The reconquest of Egypt was the last great victory of the Achaemenid Empire, and it demonstrated that the Immortals, when they were properly led and properly equipped, were still a formidable fighting force. But the victory was achieved at a terrible cost, not only in lives but in the treasure and the goodwill that were essential to the stability of the empire. Artaxerxes III, who was a brutal and vindictive ruler, plundered the Egyptian temples, killed the sacred Apis bull, and imposed a crushing tribute on the population, policies that alienated the Egyptians and that sowed the seeds of future revolts. The Immortals, who had been the instruments of this brutality, were tarnished by the association, and their reputation, which had been restored by their valor, was once again compromised by the cruelty of the king they served. The internal politics of the Persian court during the reign of Artaxerxes III were dominated by the figure of Bagoas, the eunuch Chiliarch, who had risen from the ranks of the palace servants to become the most powerful man in the empire after the king. Bagoas, who had commanded the Immortals in the Egyptian campaign, was a brilliant military organizer and a ruthless political operator, and his control over the royal guard gave him the power to make and unmake kings. The Immortals, who were under the direct command of Bagoas, became the instrument of his ambitions, and their loyalty, which had once been the exclusive possession of the king, was now divided between the throne and the Chiliarch. Artaxerxes III, who was aware of the danger but who was unable to control his powerful servant, was poisoned by Bagoas in 338 before Christ, a crime that was facilitated by the Chiliarch's control over the royal guard. The Immortals, who had been created to protect the king, were complicit in his murder, either through active participation or through passive acquiescence, and the moral rot that had been eating at the core for decades was now exposed for all to see. Bagoas, after the murder of Artaxerxes III, installed the king's youngest son, Arses, as a puppet ruler, and the Immortals, who were the enforcers of this new regime, became the tools of a eunuch's tyranny. The reign of Arses, which lasted only 2 years, was a period of terror and instability, as Bagoas purged the royal family and the nobility of any potential rivals, and the Immortals, who were the agents of these purges, were stained with the blood of the innocent. The assassination of Arses in 336 before Christ, which was also the work of Bagoas, brought to the throne a distant cousin, Codomanus, who took the regnal name Darius III, and the Immortals, who had been the instruments of so much treachery, were now tasked with protecting a king whom they barely knew and whom they had no reason to trust. The state of the Achaemenid Empire when Darius III ascended the throne in 336 before Christ was desperate, and the Immortals, who were the symbol of the empire's military power, reflected the general decay that afflicted the state. The treasury, which had been drained by the extravagance of the court and the cost of the Egyptian campaign, was empty. The satraps, who had grown accustomed to the weakness of the central authority, were semi-independent rulers who pursued their own interests, and who were often at war with one another. The army, which had once been the terror of the world, was a heterogeneous collection of levies, mercenaries, and feudal retainers, lacking the cohesion and the discipline that had been the hallmark of the Persian military. The Immortals, who were the best of the native Persian infantry, were still a force to be reckoned with, but their numbers had been depleted by the purges and the campaigns of the previous decades, and their morale, which had been shattered by the treachery and the murder that had surrounded the throne, was at its lowest ebb. The new king, Darius III, was a man of uncertain abilities, a distant relative of the royal family who had been chosen by Bagoas for his apparent pliability, but he surprised his enemies by executing Bagoas soon after his accession and by attempting to restore the authority of the crown. The Immortals, who had been the servants of Bagoas, were purged of the eunuch's partisans, and their ranks were replenished with loyalists from the noble families that had supported Darius. The young king, who had distinguished himself in single combat against the champion of the rebellious Caducei, was determined to revive the military glory of the empire, and the Immortals, who were the core of his army, were trained and equipped for the coming struggle against the Macedonian king Philip II, who was preparing to invade Asia. The assassination of Philip II in 336 before Christ, at the hands of a disgruntled bodyguard, gave the Persian Empire a brief respite, but the accession of his son Alexander, a 20-year-old prodigy who had been educated by Aristotle and who had already proven himself as a commander at the Battle of Chaeronea, was an event of world historical significance that the Persian court failed to appreciate. The Immortals, who were informed of the death of Philip and the succession of Alexander, were not impressed. The Persian military, which had been fighting Greeks for 2 centuries, had learned to respect the Greek hoplite but to despise the Macedonians, who were considered semi-barbarians, a rustic and uncouth people who had only recently emerged from the obscurity of their mountains. The Immortals, who were the finest infantry in the Persian army, were confident that they could defeat any force that the Macedonians could put into the field, and they looked forward to the coming war as an opportunity to restore their reputation and to avenge the defeats of the past. The Persian satraps of Asia Minor, who were the first to face the Macedonian invasion, shared this confidence, and they assembled a large army, including a contingent of Greek mercenaries, to meet Alexander at the Granicus River. The Immortals, who were not present at this initial battle, were held in reserve for the decisive confrontation that would occur when the king himself took the field, and they spent the months after the Granicus disaster training and preparing for the ordeal that was to come. The battle that would define the fate of the Immortals, and of the empire they served, was drawing near, and the 10,000 warriors who carried the silver and the golden apples were about to meet the Macedonian phalanx and the companion cavalry in a clash that would echo through the ages. The Battle of Issus, fought on a narrow coastal plain in November of 333 before Christ, was the first direct test of the Immortals against the full might of the Macedonian army under the personal command of Alexander, and the outcome was a catastrophe that exposed the fatal weaknesses of the Persian military system and shattered the confidence of Darius III. The Persian king, who had taken personal command of the army after the defeat at the Granicus River, had assembled a vast host at Babylon, a force that included the reconstituted Immortals, the Greek mercenaries under the command of the Athenian Charidemus and later the Rhodian Thymondas, the Cardake's heavy infantry, and the finest cavalry that the eastern satrapies could provide. The army marched westward through the Syrian gates, and Darius, who had received intelligence that Alexander was advancing southward along the coast, attempted to maneuver behind the Macedonian rear and cut his supply lines. The two armies met near the town of Issus, on a narrow strip of land between the Mediterranean Sea and the Amanus Mountains, a terrain that was far more favorable to the Macedonian tactics than the Persians had anticipated. The battlefield was constricted, with the sea on one flank and the mountains on the other, and the Persian advantage in numbers, which may have been as high as 100,000 men, was largely negated by the inability to deploy the full width of the army. The Immortals, who were stationed in the center of the Persian line, were deployed in their traditional deep formation, their shields locked, their spears leveled, their bows ready to loose a volley when the Macedonians came within range. Across the narrow plain, the Macedonian phalanx, under the command of the veteran general Parmenion, was forming up, its pikes glinting in the autumn sun, and Alexander, at the head of the companion cavalry, was riding to the right wing, preparing to lead the decisive charge. The tactical dispositions of the two armies reflected the fundamental differences between the Persian and the Macedonian ways of war. The Persian plan, as far as it can be reconstructed from the fragmentary sources, was to use the Immortals and the Greek mercenaries in the center to pin the Macedonian phalanx, while the Persian cavalry on the right wing, under the command of the satrap Nabarzanes, would attempt to turn the Macedonian left and roll up the line. The Macedonian plan, which had been perfected by Alexander on the battlefields of Greece and Thrace, was to use the phalanx as an anvil and the companion cavalry as a hammer, holding the enemy center in place while the cavalry punched through a weak point in the enemy line and attacked the command element, in this case, the person of Darius himself. The Immortals, who were the anvil in this metaphor, understood their role. They were to stand, to hold, to absorb the shock of the Macedonian pikes, and to buy time for the cavalry to win the battle on the flanks. The initial phase of the battle, the advance of the two lines, was a spectacle of disciplined movement, the long columns of the phalanx marching with their pikes upright, the Immortals moving forward with their measured, deliberate step, their spears glittering, their bows strung. The clash of the two infantries, when it came, was a thunderous collision of wood and iron, the Macedonian pikes smashing into the Persian shields, the shorter Persian spears thrusting upward at the faces and the throats of the phalangites, the screaming of the wounded, the shouting of the officers, the pushing and the shoving of the rear ranks. The Immortals, despite their courage, were at a severe disadvantage. Their spears, which were only 6 feet long, could not reach past the 18-foot pikes of the Macedonians, and their wicker shields, which were designed to stop arrows, were shattered by the heavy iron points of the sarissas. The front ranks of the Immortals were skewered, their bodies piling up, and the rear ranks, pressing forward, were unable to close the gap. The center of the Persian line was being pushed back, step by bloody step, but it was not yet broken. The decisive moment of the battle occurred on the Persian left, where Alexander, at the head of the companion cavalry, executed a charge that would become the model of cavalry tactics for centuries. Alexander had observed that the Persian cavalry on the right had been drawn out of position by the feigned retreat of the Macedonian left, and a gap had opened between the Persian center and the sea. Into this gap, Alexander led his horsemen, a wedge of armored men on armored horses, driving straight at the person of Darius, who was stationed behind the Immortals in his chariot. The panic that seized the great king when he saw the golden helmeted figure of Alexander bearing down on him was the turning point of the battle, a psychological collapse that is recorded by all the ancient sources. Darius, who had shown bravery as a young man in the Cadousian Wars, lost his nerve, and he turned his chariot and fled, abandoning his army, his family, and his empire. The Immortals, who were fighting for their lives in the center, did not immediately see the flight of the king. They were too busy trying to hold back the Macedonian phalanx, but the news, when it reached them, was a shock from which they could not recover. The royal standard, which had been the rallying point of the Persian army, was gone, and the Immortals, who were sworn to protect the person of the king, had failed in their most fundamental duty. The retreat of the Immortals, when it came, was not a rout, it was a disciplined withdrawal, a fighting retreat in which the survivors, who were less than half of the 10,000 who had marched into battle, fought their way out of the trap and rejoined the remnants of the Persian army in the hills. The dead on the field, the thousands of Persian bodies that were counted by the Macedonian victors, included many of the Immortals, their golden apples tarnished with blood, their spears broken, their shields shattered, their long and glorious history ending in the dust of Issus. The aftermath of Issus was a disaster for the Persian Empire and a personal tragedy for Darius III, who had lost his wife Statira, his mother Sisygambes, and his children to the Macedonian conqueror, and who had seen his best infantry, the Immortals, decimated in a single afternoon. The survivors of the corps, who had fought with a bravery that even Alexander acknowledged, were gathered at Damascus and later at Babylon, where they were reorganized and re-equipped for the final campaign that would decide the fate of the empire. The losses among the officer corps, the Hazarapatas and the Satopatas, who had been the backbone of the Immortals, were particularly severe, and the new commanders who were appointed to replace them lacked the experience and the prestige of their fallen predecessors. The Immortals, who had once been a corps of 10,000 men, were now reduced to a fraction of their former strength, and the replacements who were drafted to fill their ranks were raw recruits, the sons of farmers and artisans, who lacked the training and the ethos of the old aristocratic guard. The spirit of the corps, which had been battered at Thermopylae and humiliated at Plataea, was now broken, and the men who marched under the silver apples were no longer the invincible warriors of the days of Cyrus and Darius, but the survivors of a lost cause, the relics of an empire that was already dead. The year that passed between Issus and Gaugamela, from November 333 to October 331 before Christ, was a period of desperate preparation for Darius III, who understood that the next battle would be his last chance to save his throne and his dynasty. The great king sent ambassadors to Alexander, offering a ransom for his family and a partition of the empire, but the Macedonian king, who had tasted the fruits of total victory, rejected the offers with contempt. The Immortals, who were the centerpiece of the new army that Darius was assembling at Babylon, were trained and drilled with an intensity that recalled the great days of the empire, and their equipment was upgraded with captured Macedonian weapons and with armor that was forged in the workshops of Susa and Persepolis. The scythed chariots, which had been a feature of the Persian army since the days of Xerxes, were constructed in large numbers, their blades honed to a razor edge, and the war elephants, which had been procured from the Indian frontier, were trained to trample the Macedonian phalanx. The army that Darius assembled at Gaugamela, on a vast plain that had been leveled and cleared for the operation of the chariots, was the largest Persian army since the invasion of Greece, a host of perhaps 100,000 men, drawn from every corner of the empire, a final, desperate mobilization that stripped the satrapies of their garrisons and left the frontiers undefended. The Immortals, who were stationed at the center of this army, were the last hope of the Achaemenid dynasty, the men who would live or die with the king, and their hearts, if not their minds, were prepared for the ordeal that awaited them. The Battle of Gaugamela, fought on the first day of October in 331 before Christ, was the final, decisive engagement between Alexander the Great and Darius III, and it was the last battle of the Achaemenid Immortals, the end of a military tradition that had stretched back for 2 centuries and that had shaped the history of the ancient Near East. The battlefield, a vast, open plain near the ancient city of Arbela in northern Mesopotamia, had been chosen by Darius for the specific purpose of allowing his side chariots and his cavalry to maneuver, and the Persian king had taken the precaution of leveling the ground and removing any obstacles that might impede his forces. The Persian army, which was arranged in a long, deep line, consisted of the cavalry on both wings, the side chariots in front, the war elephants at intervals, and the infantry, including the Immortals and the Greek mercenaries, in the center, directly opposite the Macedonian phalanx. The Immortals, who were the personal guard of the king, were stationed in the very center of the line, surrounding the royal chariot, and their duty, as it had always been, was to protect the person of the great king and to hold the center of the battle line against any assault. The Macedonian army, which was considerably smaller, perhaps 47,000 men, was deployed in an oblique formation, with the right wing, under Alexander and the companion cavalry, advanced and refused, while the left wing, under Parmenion, was held back, a formation that was designed to provoke the Persian cavalry into a premature attack and to create a gap in the enemy line. The night before the battle, according to Plutarch, Alexander slept so soundly that his generals were forced to wake him, and when Parmenion suggested a night attack to surprise the Persians, the young king replied that he would not steal a victory, a remark that reflected his supreme confidence in the outcome of the battle. The opening phase of the battle was a massive Persian assault on the Macedonian left, a cavalry charge that was intended to pin Parmenion's wing and to prevent Alexander from executing his trademark flanking maneuver. The Persian right, under the command of the satrap Mazias, drove deep into the Macedonian line, and for a time, the baggage camp of the Macedonians was penetrated, and the Persian horsemen began to loot, a fatal distraction that allowed the Macedonian reserves to rally and drive them back. Meanwhile, on the Persian left, the scythe chariots, which had been the great hope of Darius, were launched against the Macedonian center, but the Phalangites, who had been trained to deal with this threat, opened gaps in their line and allowed the chariots to pass harmlessly through, where they were then dispatched by the light infantry in the rear. The Immortals, who were waiting in the center, watched the chariots fail, and they understood that the burden of the battle would fall on them, as it had fallen on their predecessors at Plataea and Issus. The Macedonian phalanx, which had been advancing slowly, now pushed forward with its pikes leveled, and the Immortals, who were armed with their short spears and their wicker shields, braced for the impact. The collision, when it came, was as brutal as any in the history of the corps, a grinding, shoving, stabbing melee in which the longer reach of the Sarissa gave the Macedonians a decisive advantage. The Immortals, who were packed together in a dense mass, could not bring their numbers to bear, and the front ranks were systematically slaughtered by the iron points of the Macedonian pikes. The Persian center, which was supposed to be the unbreakable anvil, was being crushed, and the Immortals, who were dying by the hundreds, began to lose their cohesion. The decisive stroke of the battle, the moment that decided the fate of the Persian Empire, was Alexander's charge with the companion cavalry, a maneuver that has been studied and admired by military commanders for over 2 millennia. Alexander, who had been leading his cavalry in a wide arc toward the Persian left, observed that the Persian cavalry on that wing had been drawn out of position by the feigned flight of the Macedonian light horse, and a gap had opened between the Persian left and the center. Into this gap, Alexander led his horsemen, forming a wedge, and he drove directly at the person of Darius, who was stationed behind the Immortals in his chariot. The Immortals, who saw the charge coming, attempted to form a defensive barrier around the king, but the Macedonian cavalry, with Alexander at its head, crashed into the Persian line with a shock that shattered the formation. The fighting around the royal chariot was desperate and bloody, the Immortals throwing themselves in front of the king, their spears and their daggers flashing, their bodies serving as a human shield against the Macedonian lances. The charioteer of Darius was killed, and the great king, who was now within sight of the golden helmet and the blazing eyes of Alexander, once again lost his nerve and fled, turning his chariot and driving through the chaos of the battlefield toward the rear. The Immortals, who had sworn to die for the king, were now faced with a choice that no soldier should ever have to make: to follow the fleeing king and abandon the army, or to stay and die on the field. The sources, which are fragmentary and contradictory, suggest that a portion of the Immortals remained and fought to the death around the empty chariot, their golden apples trampled into the dust, their bodies a mound of sacrifice that was the last heroic gesture of a dying corps. The rest of the Immortals, those who could escape, fled with the king or scattered into the hills, their discipline shattered, their mystique destroyed, their long and glorious history ending in the blood and the dust of Gaugamela. The pursuit of the defeated Persians continued until sunset, and the Macedonian cavalry, which was relentless in its pursuit, cut down thousands of the fleeing soldiers. The Immortals, who had been the core of the Persian army, were hunted across the plain, their golden apples marking them out as targets of special value, and very few of them survived the day. Darius himself, who had fled to Ecbatana in Media, was a broken man, a king without an army, a monarch without a throne, and the Immortals who accompanied him, a pitiful remnant of the 10,000, were the last guardians of a tradition that had been extinguished on the plains of Gaugamela. The Achaemenid Empire, which had stood for 220 years, was ended, not by the death of a king but by the destruction of the army that had been its foundation, and the Immortals, who had been the pride of that army, were no more. The golden apples that had glinted in the sun of 100 battlefields were buried in the sand of Gaugamela, waiting for the archaeologists of a future age to uncover them and to wonder at the story they told. The Immortals, who had been designed to be deathless, had met their end at the hands of a conqueror who was himself only mortal, and their passing marked the close of an era in the history of the ancient world. The death of Darius III in the summer of 330 before Christ, betrayed by his own satraps and stabbed in a wagon as Alexander's riders closed in, was the final, sordid chapter in the story of the Achaemenid Empire, and the fate of the surviving Immortals, who had been scattered and broken at Gaugamela, was a reflection of the chaos and the despair that engulfed the Persian state. The news of the defeat at Gaugamela had spread through the empire like a shockwave, and the satraps, who had been loyal to the king as long as he could protect them, began to look to their own interests, abandoning the Achaemenid cause and seeking to make terms with the conqueror. The Immortals who had survived the battle, perhaps a few thousand men who had been able to escape the slaughter, were gathered at Ecbatana, the summer capital of the Median kings, where Darius had fled to rally his remaining forces and to prepare for a guerrilla war in the eastern satrapies. The remnant of the Immortals, who had been the royal guard, were now the only soldiers that the king could trust, a tiny island of loyalty in a sea of betrayal, and they followed Darius on his last, desperate flight through the mountains of Media and Parthia, pursued by Alexander and the companion cavalry. The march was a nightmare of hunger, thirst, and despair, the once proud Immortals reduced to a band of ragged fugitives, their golden apples pawned for food, their scale armor discarded on the mountain passes, their discipline, which had been the hallmark of the corps, eroded by the constant fear of ambush and assassination. The officers who had survived Gaugamela, the Hazarapatus and the Satopatus who had led the Immortals in the glory days of the Egyptian campaign, were now plotting with the satraps against their own king, a final, ultimate betrayal that would extinguish the Achaemenid dynasty. The conspiracy that led to the death of Darius was hatched by Bessus, the satrap of Bactria, who was a kinsman of the king and who had commanded the cavalry of the left wing at Gaugamela, and by Barsaentes, the satrap of Arachosia, and Satabarzanes, the satrap of Aria. These men, who had been the pillars of the empire, had concluded that Darius was a liability, a defeated king who could not protect them, and they planned to seize him, to deliver him to Alexander as a peace offering, or to kill him and claim the throne for themselves. The Immortals who were still guarding the king, a few hundred loyal men who had refused to join the conspiracy, were overwhelmed by the superior forces of the satraps, and Darius was thrown into a covered wagon, bound in golden chains, a prisoner of his own nobles. The pursuit of Alexander, who had learned of the betrayal and who was racing to capture Darius alive, was one of the most dramatic episodes of the ancient world, a chase across the desert and the mountains of northern Iran, with the Macedonian cavalry riding through the night, their horses dropping from exhaustion, their riders pushing on to intercept the traitors. The Immortals who were with the king, helpless and outnumbered, could only watch as Bessus and his accomplices argued over the fate of their prisoner, and when the Macedonian riders were sighted on the horizon, the conspirators panicked and stabbed Darius, leaving him to die in the wagon, his blood staining the golden fetters that bound him. The last of the Immortals, those who had remained faithful to the end, were slaughtered by the satraps or captured by the Macedonians, and the corps that had been the pride of the Persian Empire for 2 centuries ceased to exist. Alexander, who arrived to find Darius dead, treated the fallen king with a respect that was both genuine and politically calculated. He wrapped the body of Darius in his own cloak and sent it to be buried in the royal tombs at Persepolis, a gesture that signaled his intention to present himself as the legitimate successor of the Achaemenid kings. The Immortals, or at least their memory, were part of this calculation, and Alexander, who admired the courage and the discipline of the Persian elite, sought to incorporate the remnants of the Persian army into his own forces, a policy of fusion that would culminate in the creation of the Epigoni, the 30,000 Persian youths who were trained in the Macedonian style. The Immortals, as a distinct corps, were not revived, but their ethos, their discipline, and their mystique were absorbed into the military culture of the Hellenistic world, a legacy that would endure long after the fall of the empire that had created them. The golden apples that had been the symbol of the corps were collected by the Macedonian soldiers as trophies, and some of them, preserved as heirlooms, may have been passed down through the generations, a tangible link to the lost world of the Achaemenids. The Immortals, in death, became a legend, a story that was told by the Greek historians and that was embellished and transformed over the centuries, a story of the invincible warriors who could never die, who rose from their own ashes, who fought to the last man for the glory of their king. The disappearance of the Immortals as a military institution did not mean that the tradition of an elite Persian guard was entirely extinguished, for the memory of the corps was preserved in the Iranian cultural sphere and was revived, in altered forms, by the successor empires that rose on the ruins of the Achaemenid state. The Parthians, who were a nomadic Iranian people from the steppes east of the Caspian Sea, overthrew the Seleucid successors of Alexander in the 3rd century before Christ and established an empire that would endure for nearly 5 centuries, a rival to Rome and a guardian of the Iranian cultural heritage. The Parthian military was dominated by the cavalry, the famous cataphracts and horse archers who were the ancestors of the medieval knights, and their infantry was never as prominent or as prestigious as the Achaemenid Immortals had been. Yet the Parthian kings maintained a royal guard, a corps of nobles and kinsmen who served as the bodyguards of the monarch and as the core of the army, a direct continuation of the Achaemenid tradition of a permanent, professional elite that was personally loyal to the king. The Parthian royal guard, which was composed of the finest cavalry and a smaller number of infantry, was not called the Immortals, but its function, its privileges, and its prestige were the same, and the memory of the Achaemenid corps was alive in the stories that were told in the courts of Ctesiphon and Ecbatana. The Parthians, who were proud of their Iranian identity and who claimed to be the restorers of the Persian imperial tradition, deliberately modeled their court and their army on the Achaemenid pattern, a conscious revival that was designed to legitimize their rule and to connect them to the glories of the past. The Sasanian Empire, which overthrew the Parthians in 224 after Christ and which ruled Iran until the Islamic conquest in 651 after Christ, was the most deliberate and the most successful of the Achaemenid revivals, and the Sasanian kings, who styled themselves as the heirs of Darius and Xerxes, created a military institution that was explicitly modeled on the Immortals. The Sasanian royal guard, the Zaidin, whose name means Immortals in Middle Persian, was a corps of 10,000 elite cavalry, heavily armored in chain mail and plate, armed with the long lance and the composite bow, and trained to a level of discipline and cohesion that was unmatched in the ancient world. The Zaidin, like the Achaemenid Immortals, were a permanent corps, maintained at a constant strength, and their primary function was to serve as the king's bodyguard and to form the core of the imperial army in battle. The Sasanian Immortals fought against the Romans, the Byzantines, and the Arab invaders, and they were the decisive force in many of the great battles of late antiquity, including the campaigns of Shipurae, who captured the Roman Emperor Valerian, and the wars of Khosrow-Ionishervan, who was the greatest of the Sasanian monarchs. The Sasanian Immortals, like their Achaemenid predecessors, were the visible symbol of the king's power, the men who lined the halls of the palace at Ctesiphon, who rode at the head of the army on the march, and who were the last to leave the field when the battle was lost. The continuity between the Achaemenid Immortals and the Sasanian Zaidin, though separated by 6 centuries and by the immense changes that had occurred in the intervening period, was a conscious and deliberate act of cultural memory, a recognition that the concept of an elite, permanent guard was one of the enduring legacies of the Persian imperial tradition. The Islamic conquest of Iran in the 7th century after Christ brought an end to the Sasanian Empire and to the Zaidin, but the memory of the Immortals was preserved in the literature and the folklore of the Iranian people, and it was eventually transmitted to the West through the translations of the Greek and Roman historians. The medieval Persian epic, the Shahnameh of Ferdowsi, which was completed around 1010 after Christ, is a vast poem that recounts the history of the Iranian kings from the creation of the world to the Arab conquest, and it includes vivid descriptions of the royal guard, the champions and the warriors who fought for the glory of Iran. The Shahnameh does not mention the Immortals by name, but its heroes, the paladins and the knights who are the central figures of the epic, are the literary descendants of the Achaemenid and Sasanian elites, and their exploits, their bravery, and their loyalty reflect the ethos that the Immortals had embodied. The revival of classical learning in the Renaissance, and the translation of Herodotus, Xenophon, and the other Greek historians into Latin and the vernacular languages, brought the story of the Immortals to a new audience in Europe, and the image of the 10,000 warriors who could not die became a fixture of the European imagination. The military writers of the early modern period, who were searching for models of discipline and organization that could be applied to the new standing armies of the nation-states, found in the Immortals an example of a permanent, professional corps that was maintained by a centralized state, a precedent for the regiments of the modern army. The modern scholarly debate over the historical reality of the Immortals, which we have traced throughout this documentary, is part of a larger debate over the relationship between the Greek sources and the Achaemenid Empire, a debate that has been transformed by the archaeological discoveries of the past century. The excavations at Persepolis, Susa, and Pasargadae, the decipherment of the Elamite tablets, and the analysis of the Achaemenid art and architecture have provided a wealth of information about the Persian military that was unavailable to earlier generations of scholars, and the consensus that has emerged, while still incomplete, is that the Immortals did exist as a distinct corps. That the Greek descriptions, though embellished and schematized, are fundamentally reliable, and that the Immortals were, in fact, the elite infantry of the Achaemenid Empire, a permanent, professional corps that played a central role in the military and political history of the ancient Near East. The skepticism that was fashionable in some quarters in the late 20th century, which questioned the very existence of the Immortals and which dismissed the Greek accounts as fiction, has been largely abandoned, replaced by a more nuanced understanding that recognizes the biases of the Greek sources while also acknowledging their value as historical evidence. The Immortals, like the empire they served, are no longer a myth. They are a historical reality, a reality that is still being pieced together from the fragments of the past, and their story, which is the story of the Achaemenid military, is one of the great epics of the ancient world. The depiction of the Immortals in the visual arts of the Achaemenid period, which we have already touched upon in our discussion of the Susa friezes and the Persepolis reliefs, is a subject that rewards a closer examination, because the artistic record is one of the few sources that have come down to us directly from the Persian side, unmediated by the Greek perspective. The glazed brick friezes from the palace of Darius I at Susa, which are now divided between the Louvre Museum in Paris and the National Museum of Iran in Tehran, are the most complete and the most detailed representations of the Persian royal guard that have survived from antiquity. The friezes, which originally decorated the walls of the courtyard and the audience hall of the palace, depict a procession of guardsmen who are alternating in 2 distinct costumes: the Persian dress, consisting of a long, pleated robe and a fluted felt cap, and the Median dress, consisting of a knee-length tunic over trousers and a rounded cap with a neck guard. The guardsmen are armed with a spear, a bow, and a quiver, and their faces, which are rendered in profile, have the large eyes, the straight noses, and the carefully curled beards that are characteristic of Achaemenid court art. The uniformity of the figures, which were produced using molds and standardized glazes, is a visual expression of the discipline and the cohesion that were the essence of the Immortals, and the alternation of the Persian and Median types is a symbolic representation of the dual nature of the empire, a partnership between the two dominant Iranian peoples. The friezes are not realistic portraits. They are idealized representations, designed to convey the power and the majesty of the king and his guard, but they are also a source of invaluable technical information about the equipment and the appearance of the Immortals in their ceremonial role. The reliefs at Persepolis, which cover the walls of the Apadana staircase, the doorways of the private palaces, and the facades of the royal tombs, provide additional visual evidence for the Immortals, and they are, in some respects, even more informative than the Susa friezes. The Persepolis reliefs, which were carved from the dark gray limestone of the mountain and which still bear traces of the original paint and gilding, are among the masterpieces of ancient art, and their depiction of the royal guards is a document of the visual culture of the Achaemenid court that is unparalleled in the ancient Near East. The guardsmen on the reliefs are shown in a variety of poses, standing at attention with their spears grounded, walking in procession with their bows slung over their shoulders, and seated in attendance on the king. They are depicted in the same two costume types that appear at Susa, the Persian and the Median, and the consistency of this iconography across the entire Achaemenid period, from Darius I to Artaxerxes III, is a testament to the conservatism and the continuity of the royal guard as an institution. The Persepolis reliefs also depict the inner circle of the guard, the men who are closest to the king, and these figures are distinguished by their dress, their posture, and their proximity to the throne. The king, in these scenes, is the central figure, larger than life, seated on his throne or standing under the winged symbol of Ahura Mazda, and the guardsmen who surround him are the human frame that enhances his majesty. The reliefs are a visual sermon on the nature of Persian kingship, and the Immortals, who are the most visible element of the royal entourage, are the instruments through which the king's power is made manifest. The small finds from Persepolis and other Achaemenid sites, the metalwork, the seals, and the personal ornaments that have been recovered by archaeologists, add a human dimension to the official art of the palaces, a glimpse into the lives of the individual soldiers who served in the Immortals. The seal impressions that have been found in the Persepolis treasury, which were used to authenticate documents and to secure the storage of goods, include the personal seals of officers and officials, some of whom may have been members of the royal guard. The seals depict scenes of combat, hunting, and religious ritual, and they provide an insight into the values and the aspirations of the men who owned them. The fragments of armor and weapons that have been excavated from the destruction layers of the palaces, the iron spearheads, the bronze scales, and the gold and silver fittings, are the tangible remnants of the equipment that the Immortals carried into battle. The akanax, the short sword that was the mark of the Persian warrior, has been found in a number of examples, often with elaborate scabbards and hilts that indicate the high status of their owners, and the distinctive shape of the blade, with its straight edges and its pointed tip, is a classic example of Achaemenid metalwork. These artifacts, which are scattered across museums from Tehran to London to New York, are the material traces of the Immortals, the physical evidence that confirms, in a way that texts alone cannot, the reality of the core and the sophistication of the culture that produced it. The interpretation of the Achaemenid art as a source for the history of the Immortals is a task that requires the collaboration of art historians, archaeologists, and military historians, each bringing a different set of questions and methods to the evidence. The art historian is concerned with the style, the iconography, and the meaning of the images, the way in which the guardsmen are represented, and the message that their representation was intended to convey. The archaeologist is concerned with the context of the images, the location, the date, and the function of the buildings in which they appear, and the relationship between the artistic record and the material culture that has been recovered from the same sites. The military historian is concerned with the accuracy of the depictions, the weapons, the armor, and the tactics that can be inferred from the images, and the extent to which the artistic conventions of the Achaemenid court reflect or distort the reality of the Immortals on campaign. The collaboration of these three disciplines, which has been a feature of the scholarship on the Achaemenid Empire in recent decades, has produced a much richer and more detailed picture of the Immortals than was available to earlier generations, a picture that is still incomplete, but that is constantly being refined by new discoveries and new analyses. The Immortals, who were silent in their own time, leaving no memoirs and no inscriptions of their own, have been given a voice by the modern scholars who have studied their images and their artifacts, a voice that speaks across the centuries of the courage, the discipline, and the sacrifice of the men who carried the golden apples. The logistical and administrative apparatus that sustained the Immortals, which we have glimpsed in the Persepolis fortification tablets and in the accounts of the Greek historians, was one of the most sophisticated systems of its kind in the ancient world, a bureaucratic machine that was designed to ensure that the 10,000 men were always fed, always paid, and always ready for war. The tablets, which are written in Elamite, and which date from the reign of Darius I, are a vast archive of administrative documents that record the distribution of rations, the movement of goods, and the organization of labor in the region of Persepolis. Among the thousands of entries, there are references to groups of Persians and Medes, who are receiving regular provisions, and these groups have been tentatively identified as the Royal Guard, the men who served in the Immortals and who were maintained by the state. The rations that were issued to the guardsmen included wheat and barley, sheep and goats, wine and beer, and a variety of fruits and vegetables, a diet that was rich in protein and carbohydrates, and that was designed to sustain the physical strength and the stamina of the soldiers. The tablets also record the issuance of special rations for the festivals and the celebrations of the court, occasions when the king would distribute extra food and drink to his guards as a mark of his favor, a practice that reinforced the personal bond between the monarch and his soldiers. The administrative system that the tablets reveal was a system of meticulous accounting, with every measure of grain and every head of livestock being recorded, checked, and audited, a system that was essential to the maintenance of a standing army that could not live off the land but that depended on a continuous flow of supplies from the royal storehouses. The pay and the privileges of the Immortals, which were the subject of much comment by the Greek historians, were a reflection of their status as the elite of the Persian army and as the personal servants of the king. Herodotus, in his description of the Immortals, notes that they were the most adorned with gold and the most splendid to behold, and he implies that their equipment, their clothing, and their accessories were provided by the king and were of a quality that was far superior to that of the ordinary soldiers. Xenophon, in the Cyropedia, describes the pay and the rewards that Cyrus the Great gave to his guards, including gifts of gold and silver, land grants, and promotions to high office. And although this account is idealized, it reflects a genuine tradition of royal largesse toward the military elite. The Immortals, in addition to their regular pay, which was probably in the form of rations and silver, received special bonuses for bravery in battle, and the survivors of a successful campaign could expect to return to Persia with a share of the plunder, a portion of the spoils that was distributed by the king according to merit. The golden apples that adorned the spears of the 1,000, the Meliphoroi, were not only a badge of honor but a substantial financial asset, a form of portable wealth that the guardsman could use to support his family or to invest in land and property. The privileges of the Immortals extended beyond the material. They were exempt from the ordinary taxes and tributes that were imposed on the subject peoples. They had access to the royal court and the person of the king, and their families were honored and respected throughout the empire. The service in the Immortals was, for the Persian nobility, the highest calling, a career that offered the prospect of wealth, power, and eternal glory. The recruitment and the training of the Immortals, which were the foundation of the Corps' effectiveness, were a lifelong process that began in childhood and that continued throughout the soldier's career. The young Persian noble, as we have described earlier, was educated from the age of 5 in the 3 essential skills of writing, shooting, and speaking the truth, an education that was conducted by the family and the community and that instilled the values of courage, loyalty, and discipline that were the bedrock of the Persian military ethos. The best of these young men, the sons of the noble families who had distinguished themselves in the service of the king, were selected for admission to the Immortals, a selection that was based on physical fitness, moral character, and the recommendation of the officers. The recruit, once admitted to the Corps, underwent an intensive period of training that perfected his skills with the spear, the bow, and the sword, and that accustomed him to the rigors of the march, the discipline of the camp, and the terror of the battlefield. The training of the Immortals was not only physical but psychological, designed to forge a sense of collective identity, and an unshakable loyalty to the king and to the regiment. The recruit learned the history of the corps, the names of the great commanders and the great battles, the rituals and the traditions that were the exclusive possession of the Immortals, and he was initiated into a brotherhood that was bound by oaths and sanctified by the gods. The replacement system, which ensured that the corps was always at full strength, meant that the training of new recruits was a continuous process, a pipeline that fed a steady stream of trained soldiers into the ranks, and the veteran soldiers, who were the instructors and the mentors of the new men, were the custodians of the institutional memory that was the soul of the corps. The daily life of an immortal, whether in garrison at Susa or Persepolis, or on campaign in the distant satrapies, was around a drill, guard duty, and the maintenance of equipment, punctuated by the festivals and the ceremonies of the court and the brief, intense periods of combat that were the ultimate test of the soldiers' training. The barracks, which were located within the palace complexes or in the fortified camps that were established at strategic points across the empire, were the soldier's home, the place where he ate, slept, and socialized with his comrades. The discipline of the barracks was strict, with officers responsible for the conduct and the readiness of their men, and punishments for infractions were severe, ranging from flogging to execution for cowardice or desertion. The immortal, when he was not on duty, could spend his leisure time in the pursuits that were traditional among the Persian nobility: hunting, horse racing, feasting, and the recitation of the epic poetry that celebrated the deeds of the heroes of old. The families of the Immortals, their wives and their children, often accompanied the corps on campaign, traveling in the baggage train or living in the military colonies that were established in the conquered territories, and the presence of the families was a source of motivation and a reminder of the stakes for which the soldier was fighting. The immortal, at the end of his career, could retire with honor, receiving a land grant and a pension from the king, and his sons, who had been raised in the tradition of the corps, would be the candidates for admission to the ranks, perpetuating the lineage of the Immortals across the generations. The psychological and ideological dimensions of the Immortals, the way in which the corps functioned as a symbol of Persian kingship and as an instrument of imperial propaganda, are as important to understanding their role as the details of their equipment and their tactics. The Immortals, as we have emphasized throughout this documentary, were not merely soldiers. They were the living embodiment of the imperial order, the human proof of the king's claim to be the ruler of the world. The golden apples that glittered on their spears, the scale armor that shone like the skin of a fish, the disciplined silence of their march, the precise order of their formations, all of these were elements of a visual language that communicated power, wealth, and invincibility to the subjects of the empire and to its enemies. The Immortals, when they were on parade at Persepolis or Susa, were a spectacle that was deliberately calculated to awe and to intimidate, a living tableau that reinforced the legitimacy of the king and the stability of the state. The ambassadors who came to the Persian court from the distant satrapies or from the foreign kingdoms beyond the empire were greeted by the ranks of the Immortals, and the message that they received, before they ever spoke a word to the king, was that the power of the Persian monarch was absolute, and that any resistance was futile. The Immortals were, in this sense, the primary instruments of the Persian propaganda machine, a machine that was as sophisticated and as effective as any in the ancient world. The religious dimension of the Immortals, which is often overlooked in the Greek sources, is a crucial aspect of their identity and their mystique. The Persian king, as we have seen, was the earthly representative of Ahura Mazda, the wise lord of the Zoroastrian religion, and his rule was a sacred trust, a cosmic duty to uphold the order of truth against the forces of falsehood and chaos. The Immortals, who were the king's personal guard, were the warriors of the truth, the soldiers of the sacred war, and their service was a form of worship, a way of participating in the cosmic struggle that defined the Zoroastrian worldview. The priests, the magi, who accompanied the army on the march and who performed the rituals that ensured the favor of the gods, were an integral part of the military establishment, and the Immortals, who were the most exalted of the king's soldiers, were the beneficiaries of their prayers and their sacrifices. The fire altars that were carried with the army, the sacred flames that were never allowed to be extinguished, were the symbols of the divine presence that accompanied the Immortals into battle, and the soldiers, who had been purified by the rituals of the Magi, fought with the assurance that their deaths would be rewarded in the afterlife, in the paradise of Ahura Mazda. The religious ethos of the Immortals, which fused the warrior code of the Iranian nobility with the ethical dualism of Zoroastrianism, gave the corps a moral cohesion that was rare in ancient armies, a sense of purpose that transcended the personal ambitions and the material rewards that motivated the ordinary soldier. The political role of the Immortals, their function as the ultimate guarantors of the king's authority and the enforcers of his will, was a double-edged sword that could cut both ways, as the history of the Achaemenid court amply demonstrates. The Immortals, who were the only permanent military force in the empire, were the foundation of the king's power, the men who could crush a rebellion, arrest a satrap, or depose a rival, and their loyalty was the essential condition of the stability of the state. But the same power that made the Immortals the king's servants also made them his potential masters, and the Chiliarch, the commander of the guard, was often the most powerful man in the empire after the king, a figure who could, and sometimes did, decide the succession and even the life of the monarch. The history of the Achaemenid dynasty is littered with the corpses of kings who were murdered by their own guards, from Xerxes to Artaxerxes III, and the Immortals, who were sworn to protect the royal person, were the instruments of these murders, a paradox that lies at the heart of the institution. The political power of the Immortals was a function of their proximity to the king, and their monopoly of force at the center of the empire, and the corruption of the core, which set in during the long decline of the 5th and 4th centuries before Christ, was a symptom of the larger corruption of the imperial system. A system that depended on the personal character of the monarch, and that had no institutional safeguards against the abuse of power. The legacy of the Immortals for the theory and the practice of government in the ancient world and beyond is a subject that has been largely neglected by political theorists. But it is a legacy that is worth considering. The concept of a permanent, professional guard that is loyal to the state rather than to any individual, a guard that is recruited from the citizen body and that is subject to the rule of law, is a modern invention, but its origins can be traced back to the Achaemenid experiment with a standing army that was maintained by the central government and that was independent of the feudal levies of the nobility. The Immortals, for all their limitations and their eventual corruption, were a step toward the idea of a professional military that is accountable to the sovereign and that serves the public interest, a step that was not taken by the Greek city-states, which relied on citizen militias, or by the Roman Republic, which depended on the temporary levies of the legions. The Praetorian Guard of the Roman emperors, which was the most famous of the ancient royal guards, was a direct descendant of the Immortals, and the Praetorians, like their Persian predecessors, became a political force that was both a protection and a threat to the throne, a cautionary tale that has echoed through the centuries. The modern solution to the problem of the royal guard, which is to subordinate the military to the civilian government and to embed the armed forces in a constitutional framework, is a development that was unknown to the ancient world. But the problem itself was first posed by the Immortals, the 10,000 warriors who were the pride and the peril of the Persian Empire. The representation of the Immortals in classical literature, from Herodotus to the Byzantine historians, is a rich and varied tradition that reflects the changing attitudes of the Greeks and the Romans toward the Persian Empire and its military institutions. Herodotus, who is our primary source for the Immortals, presents them with a mixture of admiration and condescension, praising their discipline and their courage while also emphasizing their exotic and, to a Greek eye, slightly barbaric appearance. The description of the Immortals in Book 7 of the Histories, with its detailed catalogue of their equipment, and its emphasis on the gold and the silver that adorned their persons, is a classic piece of ethnographic writing, a portrait of the other, that is designed to highlight both the power and the difference of the Persian Empire. Herodotus was not an eyewitness to the Persian Wars, but he interviewed survivors and consulted the records that were available to him, and his account, though embellished and schematized, is the foundation of all subsequent knowledge of the Immortals. Xenophon, who fought against the Persians at Cunaxa and who wrote the Cyropedia as an idealized portrait of Cyrus the Great, provides a different perspective, a perspective that is based on direct experience, and that is colored by his admiration for the Persian military system. Xenophon's description of the Persian army, and of the royal guard in particular, is a blend of observation and imagination, a fusion of the real and the ideal that has been a source of both insight and confusion for modern historians. The later Greek and Roman writers, from Ctesias to Plutarch to Arrian, added their own details and their own interpretations to the tradition, and the image of the immortals that has come down to us is a composite, a mosaic of fragments that must be pieced together with care and with skepticism. The reliability of the Greek sources for the history of the immortals has been a matter of intense scholarly debate, and the pendulum of opinion has swung between a credulous acceptance of the classical accounts and a radical skepticism that dismisses them as fiction. The skeptics, who were particularly influential in the late 20th century, argued that Herodotus and his successors were writing for a Greek audience that expected stories of Oriental despotism and exotic warriors, and that the immortals, with their golden apples and their invincible discipline, were a literary creation, a reflection of Greek fantasies rather than Persian realities. The skeptics pointed to the silence of the Persian sources, the absence of any mention of the immortals in the Achaemenid inscriptions and the Persepolis tablets, as evidence that the core was a Greek invention, a myth that had no basis in the actual organization of the Persian army. The problem with this argument, as the defenders of the Greek sources have pointed out, is that the Persian sources are not silent. They simply use a different vocabulary, a bureaucratic and administrative language that does not correspond to the descriptive categories of the Greek historians. The Persepolis tablets refer to groups of Persians and Medes who are receiving rations, and the royal inscriptions mention the guards and the army of the king, but they do not provide the kind of detailed description that Herodotus offers, because that was not the purpose for which they were written. The absence of the name, Immortals, in the Persian sources is not evidence of the absence of the core. It is evidence of the difference between the Persian and the Greek ways of categorizing the world. The archaeological evidence, as we have seen, has provided a powerful argument in favor of the essential reliability of the Greek accounts. The Susa friezes and the Persepolis reliefs depict guardsmen whose equipment corresponds, in striking detail, to the description that Herodotus gives of the immortals, a correspondence that is difficult to explain as a coincidence. The scale armor, the wicker shields, the short spears, the bows and the quivers, the alternation of Persian and Median dress, all of these features appear in the art and in the text, and the conjunction of the two independent lines of evidence is a strong argument for the historicity of the core. The replacement system, which is the defining characteristic of the immortals in the Greek sources, is not depicted in the art, because it was a process, not an object, but the bureaucratic capacity of the Achaemenid state, which is amply documented in the Persepolis tablets, is entirely consistent with the maintenance of a standing core of 10,000 men. The modern consensus, which has emerged from the debates of the past several decades, is that the immortals did exist, that the Greek descriptions, though they must be used with caution, are fundamentally reliable, and that the core was a unique and important institution in the military history of the ancient Near East. The skeptics have performed a valuable service by forcing the defenders of the Greek sources to examine their assumptions and to refine their arguments. But the weight of the evidence, both textual and archaeological, is now firmly on the side of the historicity of the immortals. The depiction of the immortals in modern popular culture, from the films and the graphic novels to the video games and the television series, is a reflection of the enduring fascination that the core exerts on the modern imagination, a fascination that is rooted in the same qualities that made the immortals so memorable to the Greeks: their discipline, their mystique, and their apparent invincibility. The film 300, which is based on the graphic novel by Frank Miller, presents the immortals as monstrous, masked, almost inhuman figures, a distortion of the historical reality that serves the film's fantasy aesthetic but that also captures something of the terror and the otherness that the immortals must have inspired in their enemies. The historical inaccuracies of the film, the masks, the samurai-like armor, the deformed appearance of the immortals, have been the subject of much criticism from historians, but the film is not intended to be a documentary. It is a myth, a modern version of the story that the Greeks told about the Persian Wars, a story that is as much about the present as it is about the past. The video games of the Assassin's Creed and Civilization series have also featured the immortals, presenting them as a special unit with unique abilities, a recognition of their status as the elite of the Persian army. The popular image of the Immortals, for all its inaccuracies, is a testament to the power of the original story, a story that has been told and retold for 2.5 millennia, a story that continues to evolve and to adapt to the changing tastes of the audience. The impact of the Immortals on the development of military institutions in the centuries after the fall of the Achaemenid Empire is a topic that requires a broad and comparative perspective, a perspective that traces the influence of the Persian model on the armies of the Hellenistic kingdoms, the Roman Empire, and the medieval and modern states. The Hellenistic monarchies that emerged from the wreck of Alexander's empire, the Seleucids, the Ptolemies, and the Antigonids, inherited not only the territories of the Achaemenids but also some of their military traditions, including the concept of a standing, professional army that was maintained by the king and that served as the core of the imperial forces. The Seleucid kings, who ruled over a multi-ethnic empire that included the former Persian heartland, employed Persian and Iranian soldiers in their armies, and they maintained a royal guard, the Agema, that was modeled, in part, on the Achaemenid Immortals. The Agema, which was a corps of elite infantry and cavalry, was the king's bodyguard and the shock troops of the Seleucid army, and its composition, its privileges, and its prestige were reminiscent of the Persian model. The Ptolemies of Egypt, who also ruled over a diverse and multi-ethnic population, created their own royal guard, the Agema of the Ptolemies, which included Greek, Macedonian, and Egyptian soldiers, a corps that was the functional equivalent of the Immortals in the Ptolemaic military system. The concept of a permanent, professional royal guard, which had been perfected by the Achaemenids, was one of the enduring legacies of the Persian Empire, a legacy that was transmitted to the Hellenistic world and that was adapted to the needs and the traditions of the successor kingdoms. The Roman Empire, which eventually absorbed all of the Hellenistic kingdoms and which became the dominant power in the Mediterranean and the Near East, had its own version of the Royal Guard in the Praetorian Guard, a corps that was established by Augustus in 27 before Christ and that served, with interruptions, until the reign of Constantine the Great in the 4th century after Christ. The Praetorian Guard, like the Immortals, was a permanent, professional corps that was stationed in the capital, that enjoyed special privileges and higher pay, and that served as the bodyguard of the emperor and as the core of the imperial army. The Praetorians, like the Immortals, became a political force in their own right, making and unmaking emperors, selling the throne to the highest bidder, and engaging in the same kinds of corruption and conspiracy that had plagued the Achaemenid court. The history of the Praetorian Guard is a cautionary tale about the dangers of a standing army that is too close to the seat of power, a tale that the Persians, had they left their own records, could have told with equal vividness. The Roman emperors, who were aware of the threat that the Praetorians posed, attempted to control them by dispersing their cohorts, by appointing loyal commanders, and by creating alternative bodyguards, such as the German Guard, that were independent of the Praetorian establishment. But the problem was never fully solved, and the Praetorian Guard was eventually disbanded by Constantine. A decision that marked the end of the ancient tradition of the Royal Guard that had begun with the Immortals. The revival of the Royal Guard in the medieval and early modern periods, in the form of the Varangian Guard of the Byzantine emperors, the Janissaries of the Ottoman sultans, and the Swiss Guard of the Vatican, is a continuation of the tradition that the Immortals inaugurated, a tradition that has evolved but that has never entirely disappeared. The Varangian Guard, which was composed of Norse and Anglo-Saxon mercenaries, was a corps of elite infantry that was renowned for its size, its strength, and its ferocity, and its loyalty, which was purchased with gold and privilege, was legendary. The Varangians, like the Immortals, were the personal bodyguards of the emperor, and they were often the decisive force in the battles of the Byzantine Empire, a foreign elite that was more reliable than the native troops because they had no ties to the local aristocracy and no interest in the intrigues of the court. The Janissaries, who were recruited from Christian boys, converted to Islam, and trained as an elite infantry corps, were the terror of Europe for centuries, a standing army that was loyal to the Sultan and that was the backbone of the Ottoman military until its corruption and its eventual destruction in the 19th century. The Swiss Guard, which still stands sentinel at the Vatican, is a surviving example of a royal guard that has retained its ceremonial function while also serving as a modern security force, a direct descendant of the Immortals in their role as the custodians of the king's person. The Immortals, who were the first of this long line of elite royal guards, set the pattern that has been followed, with variations, by every subsequent institution of its kind, a pattern that combines privilege, discipline, and proximity to power, a pattern that is as enduring as it is dangerous. The story of the Immortals that we have told in this documentary, from their shadowy origins in the highlands of Fars to their final, heroic stand on the plains of Gaugamela, is more than the chronicle of a single military unit in a long-vanished empire. It is the story of the Achaemenid Empire itself, in its glory and its ruin, its ambition and its hubris, its capacity for order and its tendency toward chaos. The Immortals were the creation of a monarchy that understood, with a clarity that was rare in the ancient world, that power, to be stable, must be institutionalized, that loyalty, to be reliable, must be cultivated, and that an empire, to be durable, must be defended by men who have a stake in its survival. The 10,000 warriors who carried the silver and the golden apples were not merely soldiers. They were the pillars of the imperial order, the human foundation on which the throne of the King of Kings rested. They were the visible symbol of the king's authority, the terror of his enemies, the guarantors of his peace, and, in the end, the instruments of his destruction. Their discipline, their equipment, their tactics, and their mystique were the product of a military tradition that had evolved over centuries on the Iranian plateau, and that had been refined by the experience of conquest and empire. The Immortals, at their best, were the finest infantry in the world, a force that could march across continents, fight on any terrain, and absorb casualties that would have shattered any other unit. At their worst, they were the Praetorians of a decadent court, the enforcers of a corrupt regime, the betrayers of the kings they were sworn to protect. The history of the Immortals is a history of both triumph and tragedy, a mirror of the empire they served. The lessons that the Immortals offer to the modern student of military history and of the relationship between the state and its armed forces are as relevant today as they were 2.5 millennia ago. The first lesson is that the creation of a permanent, professional military institution is a necessary condition for the survival of a large, multi-ethnic state, but it is also a source of political danger that must be managed with care. The Immortals were the foundation of the Achaemenid Empire, but they were also the agents of its decay, a paradox that has been repeated in the history of every subsequent empire. The second lesson is that the mystique of an elite unit, the aura of invincibility that surrounds it, is a double-edged sword. It can demoralize the enemy and inspire the troops, but it can also breed arrogance and complacency. And when the aura is shattered, as it was at Thermopylae and Gaugamela, the psychological damage can be catastrophic. The third lesson is that the effectiveness of a military institution depends not only on its equipment and its training but on the character and the leadership of the men who command it, and that the corruption of the officer corps is the surest sign of the impending collapse of the institution. The Immortals, who were led by some of the greatest generals of the ancient world and by some of the most perfidious, illustrate this truth with the clarity of a parable. The memory of the Immortals, which has been preserved and transmitted across the centuries by the Greek historians, the Persian epic tradition, and the modern popular culture, is a testament to the enduring power of a good story. The Immortals, who were silent in their own time, who left no memoirs and no monuments of their own, have been given a voice by the generations that came after them, a voice that speaks of courage and sacrifice, of loyalty and betrayal, of glory and ruin. The golden apples that glinted on their spears are tarnished now, and the dust of Gaugamela covers their bones, but their legacy, the idea that a small, disciplined force can change the course of history, lives on. I hope you enjoyed this content, and I'll see you in the next video.